Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. It was the summer of 2004, near Bristol Bay County in Alaska. I had just finished a tough commercial fishing season and decided to spend some time inland. I wanted to do something different, so I teamed up with a good friend who shared my interest in wildlife. We planned to spend a few days out there, photographing bears and the local scenery. The idea was to maybe start a small side business guiding tourists to see bears safely, and we figured we could gather some decent shots to promote it. We ended up seeing a lot more bears than we anticipated, over 40 in just 5 days. Some wandered through open meadows, others fished in small creeks, and a few even ventured close to our camp, though never threatening us. We'd sit behind a makeshift blind, snapping pictures, quietly whispering our observations to each other. The area was rich with wildlife, and until that last day, everything felt normal, even peaceful. But on that final morning, I woke up feeling tense. The air had changed somehow. It was slightly cooler, and everything seemed quieter. My friend noticed it too. We went out after breakfast, following a small riverbank, hoping to catch sight of a bear feeding at dawn. Instead, we found something else, prints in the mud. At first, I assumed they might be from a large bear, but the shape wasn't right. The tracks were huge, broader than any human foot, but they had a peculiar outline, almost like a massive, elongated human footprint. The toes seemed off. They weren't spaced like a bear's claws or a moose's hooves. It looked like a giant, bare human foot, but at least twice the size of mine. And I'm not a small guy. The depth of the track was unsettling. Even the largest bears we'd seen didn't leave prints that deep. We had been moving carefully on soft ground all week and never saw anything like this. I knelt down and tried to compare my boot to the print. It dwarfed my size 11 boot easily. As I hovered my hand over it, I remember feeling this strange unease, like my body was telling me not to linger too long. My friend just stared, not saying a word at first. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and uneasy. What the hell made this? We followed the tracks for about 20 or 30 yards until the terrain got dense and muddy. They just sort of disappeared into thicker brush. No sign of anything else. No claw marks like a bear might leave on a tree trunk. No fur caught on branches. No scat nearby. Nothing. It was as if something heavy and two-legged had moved through there very recently, then vanished. After that, the feeling of being watched started to creep in. At first I thought I was just spooked by the weird footprints, but it grew stronger as the day went on. We tried to continue with our routine, finding good vantage points for photography, setting up the camera, checking the direction of the wind, but something felt off. Every once in a while I'd turn around, sure that I'd catch a glimpse of something ducking behind a tree. I saw shadows where there shouldn't be any. My friend swore he heard low grunts or heavy breathing from somewhere behind us. We both tried to tell ourselves it was just our imaginations running wild, but neither of us believed it. We'd heard some strange local stories before heading out. An old hermit who lived deeper in the woods told tales of a tall, hairy creature that watches people from a distance, sometimes even following them silently. We'd laughed it off, thinking it was just local folklore. But as the day dragged on, those stories stopped feeling so funny. At one point, around midday, we took a break near a small clearing. I remember the place well, a few fallen logs, some ferns, and a little patch of sunlight breaking through the canopy. We were both on edge, and I kept scanning the perimeter while my friend drank some water. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a sharp crack, like a branch being snapped under heavy weight. We both froze. My friend carefully stood up, slowly, his camera in hand, and scanned the tree line. I followed his gaze, trying to spot what made that noise. Nothing moved. Not a single branch swayed. No bird took flight. It was unnaturally still, like something held its breath just out of sight. The next few hours were a blur of anxiety. We kept moving, sticking closer together than before, trying not to lose our cool. Every once in a while, I caught a glimpse of something dark between the trees, large, upright, and gone in a blink. It was always too quick for me to truly see, but the shape was tall, much taller than any bear I'd ever seen on its hind legs. I know how bears move. I know their silhouettes. This was different. The proportions felt off, like it wasn't just a bear standing up briefly. It seemed comfortable being on 2 feet, moving swiftly and quietly, always at the edges of our vision. We didn't say much to each other. There wasn't anything to say. We were both scared, but too proud to admit it out loud. We just moved faster. We weren't even focusing on photography anymore. We just wanted to get back to camp. The plan was to pack up before dusk and head to the truck, which was parked about an hour's hike away. We were losing daylight, and neither of us wanted to be out there after dark, not after what we'd seen. While we gathered our things at the campsite, I swear I heard heavy footsteps circling us. It was like something was pacing around just beyond the tree line. I could almost feel it glaring at me. The back of my neck prickled, and I was certain something was watching, waiting to see what we'd do. My friend tried to act calm, but his hands were shaking as he stuffed gear into his pack. We moved quickly, not bothering to double-check our inventory. We just needed to get out of there. As we made our way along the trail toward where we'd parked, the forest felt oppressive. Every sound, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, sounded like a threat. Even the wind in the trees felt wrong, like it carried whispers. At one point, we heard a low, guttural sound. Not a roar, not a growl, but something deeper, like a vocalization from a throatway larger than ours. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, then cut off abruptly. We stopped, listened, and all we heard was silence. No birds, no small animals, nothing. That might have been the worst part. Even the normal forest life seemed to vanish when this thing was around. When we finally reached the truck, it was almost sunset. We threw our gear in, jumped in the cab, and locked the doors. I remember my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. We sat there for a moment, catching our breath, looking out the windows. Nothing followed us into the open clearing where we'd parked. It was as if, once we left the dense part of the forest, it lost interest or decided not to show itself. We didn't see any creature step forward. We never got a clear look at it. But we knew something had been out there, watching us, moving around us, making sure we knew it was there. We drove off and didn't speak much until we were well away from the area. Eventually, we tried to rationalize it. Maybe a bear walking strangely. Maybe our nerves playing tricks. But deep down, I know that wasn't any bear. I've been around bears my entire life. I've seen big ones, aggressive ones, even starving ones. None of them behaved like this. None of them left prints like the ones we found. None of them paced us, stayed hidden, and made the forest feel so wrong. To this day, I can't explain it. I don't have any proof beyond the blurry feelings in my memory and the weird footprints we saw. We took a few pictures of the track, but they just looked like vague impressions in the mud. Nothing conclusive. We never told anyone official about it. Who would believe us? But I know what I felt that day. I know how scared I was. And I'm still not sure what watched us from behind those trees, following silently, letting us know it was there without ever really showing itself. We never went back to that exact spot. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, watching anyone who dares to wander too deep, leaving no clear evidence behind, just an unsettling presence. I'm not sure I want to know. It happened, then it stopped, like it never even occurred. But I remember it, and I'm pretty sure I always will. Story 2. I remember it was summer 2005, and me and my friend Matt were hiking in the Kennicott area of Alaska. We'd set out early that morning, planning to reach a small campsite near the glacier by sundown. The trail wasn't anything spectacular at first, just the usual mix of damp earth, thick moss, and the kind of low, twisted trees you see in that part of Alaska. We knew the route from a guidebook, and while it warned us about wildlife, bears and maybe wolves, neither of us gave much thought to anything else. I guess we were a bit slower than we planned, or maybe we just underestimated how tired we'd be after hours of trekking uphill. By the time the sky turned a dull purple, we still had a ways to go. Instead of pushing on through the dark, we decided to set up camp right there. I remember feeling uneasy about it, not for any specific reason, just a vibe. The air was colder than it had been earlier. The silence felt heavier. But I brushed it off, because you don't want to admit you're spooked by nothing. We cleared out a small patch in the brush, close enough to the trail so we wouldn't lose it the next morning, but tucked off a bit for some privacy. We pitched our small tent, strung up our food in a nearby tree to keep it away from bears, and got a small campfire going. The sound of the fire crackling helped break that weird tension, and for a moment things felt normal. I was a smoker back then. After setting things up, I left Matt by the fire while I stepped away to have a cigarette. The idea was just to walk a little down the trail, where the smoke wouldn't blow back into the tent area, and enjoy a quick break before turning in for the night. I remember the ground felt springy under my boots, and the air smelled like wet leaves and something else I couldn't place. I was maybe 20 or 30 yards from the campsite, just out of sight of the tent's glow. There was a point where I paused to light my cigarette. I cupped my hands around the lighter, and as the flame flickered, my eyes adjusted to the darkness around me. That's when I saw it. At first, I honestly thought it was just a person, or more like the silhouette of a person. I saw a dark shape standing maybe 15 feet off the trail. It looked like someone had stopped there, frozen, maybe caught off guard seeing me. I stared, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. For a moment, I thought it was a man standing next to a bicycle or something with handlebars because of the posture, legs apart, arms bent at the elbows, almost like gripping invisible handles. Except there was no bike, and it wasn't moving. I called out quietly, something like, "Hey, Matt." But my voice sounded too thin, and I knew it couldn't be Matt. He was back at the campsite. The figure didn't respond, didn't even flinch. It just stood there, completely still. The shape was weirdly tall, at least a head taller than me, and I'm just under 6 feet. Its shoulders were broad, and the outline of its body seemed too thick, like it was bundled in heavy fur or something. But we weren't near any cabins, and nobody hikes out there in a bulky costume. I remember feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My heart was pounding, and I suddenly became really aware of how quiet the woods were. No wind, no birds, just this heavy silence. I took a step back, my boots crunching softly on the leaf litter. The figure moved. Not a big movement, but enough to break that eerie stillness. I couldn't see details, just the outline shifting slightly. That's when I realized that what I took for arms weren't in a relaxed stance. They were bent, raised, as if it was holding something, or just ready to grab something. I remember wanting to call out to Matt again, but my throat felt tight. Instead, I whispered something to myself, maybe a swear or a prayer, I don't know. I forced my voice louder and said something like, "Matt, come here!" I tried to sound casual, but I'm pretty sure I sounded terrified. The instant I raised my voice, the figure jerked, as if startled. Then it did something that made me almost drop my cigarette. It stepped backward. I heard branches crack under its foot. This wasn't silent like a ghost. It moved like a heavy creature, and it was definitely on two legs. No animal that big just stands upright like that. It took another step, and its shape turned slightly. I caught a glimpse of what might have been its head shifting toward me before it quickly retreated into the darker part of the woods. It was so fast. It didn't run like a man. It was more like it just flowed into the darkness, heavy but fluid. I could still hear the brush swish and break as it moved away. Matt came rushing over, flashlight in hand, squinting into the darkness. He kept asking what was wrong. I just pointed in the direction where the figure had been, but of course by then it was gone. There was nothing to see except trees and shadows. Matt tried to calm me down. We scanned the area with the flashlight beams. The light caught only bark and branches, and I started to feel stupid. But I knew what I saw. It wasn't human. Or if it was like no human I'd ever seen. We spent probably an hour with our backs close together, me holding a trekking pole like a weapon, and Matt shining the flashlight around, just waiting for something to happen. We considered packing up and leaving right then. But it was dark, we were tired, and the trail wasn't easy to follow without daylight. Neither of us said it out loud, but we both knew we were stuck there for the night. We put out the fire, figuring less light might mean we wouldn't attract any attention. We got inside the tent and zipped it tight. I remember lying there, every sound making me flinch. The wind picked up at some point, rattling branches. Each time I heard a crack or rustle, I held my breath, waiting to hear something heavier, something that would confirm I wasn't imagining things. But nothing else happened that night. No screams, no snarls, no footsteps circling our camp. Just the distant sighs of the forest. Eventually, exhaustion caught up with me, and I drifted off into a nervous, shallow sleep. The next morning, we got up as soon as there was enough light to see the trail. We looked around the spot where I saw the figure. The ground was covered in ferns and old leaves. If there were footprints, we couldn't make them out clearly. Everything was damp and springy. We checked for broken branches. There were a few snapped twigs low to the ground, but it could have been us, or just normal forest debris. We found nothing that screamed Bigfoot or unknown creature. We just found emptiness and silence. The forest had that calm morning hush, and if you didn't know better, you'd think it was perfectly safe. We didn't talk much as we packed up. Both of us were on edge, our eyes darting around. I think we were both asking ourselves what we really believed we saw. Was it a bear rearing up strangely? But bears don't stand like that, and they definitely don't have that shape. Could it have been some weird tree stump that looked human in the dark? But I heard it move. I heard the branches break under its weight. I watched it step away on two legs. And it was tall, taller than any person I've met, and I've met some big guys. We hiked out of there at a brisk pace, trying not to look like we were running, but definitely not dawdling. I kept turning my head to look behind us, expecting to see that figure trailing at a distance, but there was nothing, just trees and morning light. We never told anyone else about this, not because we don't trust our friends or family, but because it sounds crazy. We were two grown men, sober and experienced hikers. Telling people we saw something that looked like a massive, upright creature in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness would just invite jokes and disbelief. We weren't harmed, we weren't chased down, and maybe that's what makes it so unsettling. It appeared, stood there, let me see it, and then vanished. I'm not sure what it wanted, or if it even cared that we were there. To this day, I can't explain it. I don't know if it was a Bigfoot or some other undocumented species. All I know is that I saw something standing there in the darkness, far too large and too strange to be a man. It watched me, then slipped away like it never existed. That night's memory still gives me goosebumps. I can't shake the feeling that we trespassed into something's territory, and it just chose not to escalate things. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, watching other hikers who don't even know it's there, or if it was just a one-time encounter that I'll never fully understand. I guess I'll never know. Story 3. Back in 1998, I was up near TL-kitna, Alaska, on a hunting trip with a buddy of mine. We were both pretty experienced hunters, had been out in the backcountry more times than I can count, so we knew what to expect from the local wildlife. We'd hunted moose, black bears, and even the occasional grizzly. Neither of us was easily spooked, and we knew how to handle ourselves out there. But there's something that happened on one particular day that still has me unsettled, even now. It was late in the afternoon. We had found a good vantage point on a small slope, looking down at a clearing below us, hoping to spot some caribou. The day was overcast and a bit chilly, but nothing unusual for that time of year. Visibility was decent, and the area was quiet, just the typical sounds of the forest settling into the late afternoon. My buddy and I were using our binoculars, scanning the tree line, waiting for some movement. After a while, we spotted a few caribou way off, but they were too far to do anything about. We just kept watching, hoping they'd come closer. After maybe 20 minutes or so, I noticed something strange moving along the edge of the clearing. At first, I couldn't tell what it was. My eyes caught this tall, broad figure. It wasn't a moose, wasn't a bear, didn't match anything I knew. It looked kind of grayish, not the dark brown or black you'd expect from a bear. And it was walking on 2 legs. Not just standing on hind legs like a bear might, but actually walking, calm, steady steps, 1 foot in front of the other. I remember my heart starting to pound. I nudged my buddy and whispered something like, "You see that?" He raised his binoculars and got quiet. Real quiet. The kind of quiet where you know the other person is seeing exactly what you are, and they have no explanation either. What we were looking at was, I don't know, man. It looked tall and bulky, but it didn't have the shape of a person in heavy gear. It was more massive, especially through the shoulders. Its arms seemed long, swinging a bit as it moved. The hair, it definitely had hair, looked kind of long and grey, maybe a bit lighter in some spots. The thing was just moving between trees, not in a hurry, almost like it was looking around or foraging. It would step behind a tree, pause, then step out and move to another, like it was trying to stay partly hidden, but also curious. We watched it for what felt like forever, but was probably more like half an hour. It never got close enough for us to see its face in perfect detail, just the outline, the fur, the way it moved. That movement is what got me. So fluid, so deliberate. I've seen bears stand up. I've seen them move around a bit on 2 legs. This was different. It didn't wobble or look awkward. It just walked, with a kind of confidence that shook me up inside. At one point, a small group of caribou wandered into the clearing. I remember thinking, now we'll see what this thing does. But the moment those caribou showed up, it slipped away so quietly and quickly that if I'd blinked, I would have missed it. 1 second it was there, next second it was gone. We kept scanning and scanning, but it had just melted back into the woods. For a long while, neither of us said anything. We just sat there, feeling the wind pick up a bit, feeling the weight of what we had seen. Eventually, we had to head back to meet the pilot, who was scheduled to pick us up and fly us out. When he arrived and asked how our day went, I couldn't hold it in. I told him we saw something weird. I didn't even know how to say it. Just described it as this huge, hairy, 2-legged thing. He got this funny look on his face, and then he told us something I hadn't really taken seriously before. He mentioned that the native folks in the area sometimes talk about a hairy man that roams the forests. I'd heard those stories before, just campfire tales, I thought. We'd always rolled our eyes at that kind of thing, but hearing it from him, in that moment, after what we'd just seen, it made my skin crawl. He said he'd never seen it himself, but he'd heard enough stories over the years that he didn't dismiss it outright. We flew out of there, and I remember staring down at the endless expanse of trees and thinking about what could be out there, living in those remote parts that people rarely set foot in. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, or a strangely shaped bear. But deep down, I knew bears don't walk like that. They don't carry themselves like that. Moose sure don't, and no human would be wandering around up there, dressed in what? A massive grey suit. That makes no sense. My buddy wouldn't talk much about it after we got back. I think he was trying to just push it out of his head. Me, I can't stop thinking about it. I never felt threatened by it, not directly. It didn't chase us, didn't make any aggressive moves. But something about seeing it there, moving so naturally in a place we thought we understood, rattled me. It made me realize I don't know everything about these lands, and maybe the stories that sound ridiculous over a campfire aren't so ridiculous after all. To this day, I haven't got a solid explanation. It wasn't a known animal, that's for sure. I used to laugh off stories of Bigfoot or anything like that. Now, I'm not so quick to dismiss them. Even thinking about it now, I can remember the quiet tension in the air, the way we just sat there, binoculars pressed to our faces, hearts racing, that feeling of confusion, of being confronted by something that just shouldn't exist according to what I believed. I still feel that unease in my gut. And the weirdest part is how it all ended. Just like that, it vanished, and we never saw it again. After we left, we heard nothing else. No strange sounds that night. No footprints found the next morning. Nothing. It was like the forest swallowed it up without a trace. One moment, our world made sense. The next, we had this memory that still doesn't fit into anything logical. And then it was gone. I guess I'm sharing this because after all these years, I still can't shake that day from my mind. I know a lot of people will say I misidentified a bear or some guy in a suit, but I swear to you, I know what I saw. There's something out there, something that doesn't fit neatly into our understanding. I don't have proof, just that memory burned into my brain. And as frustrating as it is to have no solid answers, it's the truth of what I experienced. All I can say is that day changed how I look at these woods. I still hunt, still spend time out there, but now I keep an eye out for things that don't quite add up. I'm more cautious, more aware that we might share these remote places with something we can't explain. I wish I had some satisfying conclusion, but I don't. It happened, and it ended, and I'm still left wondering. That's all there is to it. Story 4. I still remember that night in December of 2002 like it was yesterday. I was with 3 close friends near Haynes, Alaska. We were young, curious, and probably a bit too confident for our own good. The idea was simple. Take a walk through the woods after it had gotten dark, talk about weird stuff like Bigfoot and UFOs, and just freak each other out a little. We'd been hearing these rumors around town, and while I didn't fully believe in anything like that, I have to admit I was intrigued. The air was bitterly cold, my breath coming out in short, foggy puffs. The snow on the ground was thick and seemed to swallow up every sound, so every step we took felt strangely muffled. Even our voices sounded quieter than normal. We headed off the main road and into the trees. It got dark fast, the sky was clear, and there was a slight moonlight shining on the snow, but under the canopy of the trees it was nearly pitch black. We had flashlights, but their beams just sort of carved out narrow tunnels of light that didn't do much to make us feel safe. I remember we started talking about Bigfoot sightings people claimed to have around Alaska. Some folks in town said there'd been weird howls and strange footprints. We were joking at first, making fun of each other, saying stuff like, "If a Bigfoot grabs you, I'm leaving you behind." That kind of teasing. But as we walked deeper, the mood shifted. Maybe it was the silence. The woods were unnaturally quiet. No wind, no birds, just the crunch of our boots and our low voices. At some point, we decided to head back because it was getting too cold to keep going. That's when things started getting weird. As we turned around and began retracing our steps, I swear I heard something that sounded like a distant bark. It was faint and could have been an echo, maybe a wild dog. But it sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. One of my friends said, "Did you hear that?" We all stopped and listened. Nothing. Just silence again. It might have been our imaginations, right? We kept walking. After a few minutes, we heard it again, that distant barking sound, a bit louder this time. It sounded angry, or maybe panicked. I couldn't tell. We tried to ignore it and move faster. Our pace picked up because none of us wanted to admit we were scared, but I could feel the tension rising. The snow crunched louder now, or maybe I was just more aware of it. After another minute or two, I felt something whiz by my face. I stopped and swung my flashlight around. My friend cursed under his breath. Something small, maybe a snowball, had just been tossed at us. None of us had thrown it. We scanned the trees with our flashlights. Nothing. We figured it must have been some kind of chunk of snow falling off a branch. But then it happened again, this time hitting my coat. It wasn't ice falling. It was like something or someone was lobbing these small balls of snow at us from behind the trees. I shouted, "Hey, cut it out!" But there was no response. We were all on edge now. We formed a tighter group and kept shining our lights around. All we ever saw were branches and trunks and the occasional shadow when our beams moved. But I swear I caught a glimpse of something once, like a large shape shifting behind a tree just out of range of the light. We didn't smell anything weird, didn't hear any heavy breathing, just those faint barking sounds from time to time, and the occasional crunch of what sounded like footsteps out of sync with ours. Every so often, I'd hear a twig snap somewhere off to the left or right, always just beyond where the flashlight could reach. We started moving faster, basically trudging through the snow as best we could. My heart was hammering in my chest. My feet were going numb from the cold, but I didn't care. I just wanted out of there. We tried to talk quietly among ourselves, debating what the hell was going on. Was it some prank? Locals messing with us? But who would come out here in the freezing cold at night just to pelt us with snow and creep us out? It made no sense. The barking got closer, or at least it seemed like it. I remember thinking it didn't quite sound like a normal dog. It was too rhythmic, almost like it was trying to mimic a dog's bark without being one. That's when I really started to panic inside. My friend in front kept shining his flashlight ahead while I swung mine behind us, expecting to catch someone at any second. But the beam would only reveal more blackness and those thick, snow-covered branches. At one point, we all stopped dead. We heard something move quickly across the path we had just walked, like a heavy body rustling through the brush. We aimed our lights at the spot where we thought it had crossed, and we saw branches still shaking lightly, scattering a bit of snow. But no body, no figure. It was like this presence was toying with us, always one step ahead, always staying just out of sight. By now, we were basically jogging, stumbling over roots hidden under the snow, grabbing onto each other's jackets to keep together. The cold air was burning my lungs, and my hands were shaking, partly from fear, partly from the temperature. We didn't talk much then. We just pushed forward, trying to reach the edge of the forest where the open road would be. We must have been about 100 yards from the tree line when it happened again. Another small snowball hit my friend in the back. He spun around, yelling, and I caught a glimpse, just for a fraction of a second, of something tall, ducking behind a large spruce. I can't say it was Bigfoot or anything that definite. I just saw a shape, tall, broad, not like a person dressed in heavy winter gear. It moved too fast and too smoothly. That sight still haunts me. I don't think I've ever admitted it clearly before, but that split second, made my heart drop. It felt wrong, like something that shouldn't be there, a presence I couldn't comprehend. We bolted. We didn't care if we fell or stumbled. When we finally burst out onto the open road, the world suddenly felt safer, even though we were still shaking. The barking noise had stopped, and the snowballs stopped coming. We were gasping for air, shining our flashlights back into the trees, but we saw only darkness and the stillness of the forest. No movement, no sound, just the quiet hum of our own panic and the empty road stretching ahead. We hurried back to the place we were staying. None of us slept well that night. Nobody wanted to talk about it much after we'd slammed the door shut behind us. We tried to laugh it off the next morning, but I could see the unease in everyone's eyes. No one had a good explanation. Some said it could have been a big animal like a moose or a bear acting strangely, but why would it throw snow? Others half-joked it was a Bigfoot, even though none of us were ready to fully believe that. I still think about it every now and then. We went into those woods just looking to spook each other with creepy stories, and we got a lot more than we bargained for. We never found footprints we could confirm, and we never saw a face. Just that vague shape, the strange barking, the snowballs, and that unsettling feeling of being stalked. To this day, I have no idea what followed us that night. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe it was something else entirely. All I know is that it ended as abruptly as it started. Once we left the woods, it was over, and we never got any closure or explanation. It still sends a chill through me to remember it. Story 5. Back in February 2004, I remember it was a cold night, but nothing out of the ordinary for that time of year in Anchorage. A few of us decided to head out on our snowmobiles near the eastern side of Potter Marsh, not too far from those utility line clearings. We did this kind of thing often, riding late at night, just to feel that empty silence you get when nobody else is around. There was fresh snow on the ground, completely untouched, not a single track besides the ones we were leaving behind. It felt like we were the first people out there in days. We'd been going for maybe half an hour, cruising at a decent speed, the headlamps on our sleds lighting the way. Everything looked normal, just that flat white surface stretching out, a few scraggly trees here and there, and the distant hum of the city way behind us. Then one of us, I think it was me actually, noticed something odd. Fresh footprints cutting across the open area we were passing through. At first I thought it was strange, but not impossible. Maybe a hiker, maybe someone on snowshoes. But these tracks were large and wide. Too big to be a person, at least any person I'd ever seen out there. They didn't look like bear prints either. I've seen bear tracks in the snow. These were different. The shape was off, more like a massive human foot, but without the neat shape of a boot print. Just deep, elongated impressions that sunk way deeper than our own boots would have. I remember cutting my engine and leaning forward, squinting, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The others were off to the side, still revving their engines, clueless to why I'd stopped. I followed the footprints slowly with my eyes. They led over a small rise, kind of a gentle slope that blocked some of my view. The night was quiet. Really quiet. I didn't hear animals' wind, nothing, just the faint rumble of my friends' snowmobiles behind me. I think that silence is what made me feel uneasy. Normally, even at night, you'd hear something, distant traffic, a plane overhead, maybe a bird. But it was dead silent. Curiosity got the better of me, so I nudged my snowmobile forward, following those strange tracks. As I came up over that slight rise, my headlights washed over the far side, and that's when I saw it. Something huge and dark, standing maybe 30 feet ahead, half turned away from me. It was tall, easily over 7 feet, maybe more. Thick torso, broad shoulders, covered in something dark and shaggy. The hair or fur wasn't neat. It looked matted in places, like something that's been living rough for a long time. and it stood on two legs, arms hanging down low, but it held itself with a weird kind of balance you wouldn't expect in deep snow. The moment my light hit it, that thing bolted. It didn't drop to all fours, didn't lumber clumsily. It ran on two legs, fast, just tearing through that powdery snow like it was nothing. No stumbling, no slipping. Honestly, that's what freaked me out the most, how fluid it moved. There's a certain logic you expect with large animals in deep snow. They sink, they struggle, they're slower. Not this thing. It moved like it was built for that terrain. I panicked and squeezed the brake, the snowmobile skidding a bit. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. As soon as I stopped, the thing vanished behind a cluster of trees to the left. It was like it took a single bound and was gone. I sat there for a few seconds, stunned, just staring into the darkness beyond my headlights. When I finally turned around and went back to my friends, I tried to tell them what I'd seen. Naturally, they thought I was messing around, maybe trying to scare them. One suggested it had to be a bear standing up on its hind legs before running off, which I knew wasn't right. Another said maybe it was some huge guy out there, a hunter or a crazy mountain man. But that didn't fit either. I know what a person looks like running in deep snow, and nobody can move like that. And a bear would have dropped to all fours in a blink. It wouldn't just sprint off like a sprinter in a track meet. I'm not the type to scare easily, but I felt something was seriously off. The footprints were still there, plain as day. I tried to show them the tracks where I first saw them, but in the darkness, with our headlights bouncing around, it just looked like random impressions to them. Also, as we moved around, we ended up messing up the area with our own tracks. The whole scene got muddled. They laughed it off, saying I must have imagined it, or maybe caught sight of some weird shadow. But I know what I saw. I can still see it in my mind, that upright figure, broad and dark, running away from the light. The way it moved, there was no hesitation, no stumbling. It was like it owned that space. It moved with a purpose, like it knew exactly where it was heading. And the silence that followed after it disappeared was even worse. It was like every sound just got sucked out of the night. I didn't smell anything in particular, but I remember this sense of being watched. Even after it was gone, I felt like it might circle back, that it might be behind one of the trees, waiting. We didn't stick around much longer after that. I wasn't in the mood to keep exploring, and I definitely wasn't interested in following those tracks any deeper into the woods. I convinced the others to head back, even though they thought I was being paranoid. On the ride back, I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the tree line with my peripheral vision, hoping I wouldn't see it again. But I never did. I tried to forget about it. I tried to chalk it up to some weird animal or even a trick of the light. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. And it wasn't a bear, and it sure as hell wasn't some guy out there messing with us. Over the years, I've thought back to that night more times than I'd like to admit, wondering what it could have been. I've heard stories, things people claim to see in these remote areas. At the time, I was skeptical of that kind of stuff. But after that night, I'm not so sure anymore. I never found an explanation. That night, what I saw was bigger and faster than any human in that terrain. It had a shape and movement I can't explain. And as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, just like that. It still gives me chills to think about. There's nothing else I can say. It happened, and then it ended, leaving me with this unsettled feeling I can't shake. Even now, I can't wrap my head around what I encountered. All I know is that it was there. It was real, and I can't prove any of it. But I'll never forget it. Story 6. I remember that day in 1997, like it just happened yesterday. We were driving back home towards Delta Junction, Alaska, after a day spent in town taking care of some errands. I was in the driver's seat. My wife sat beside me, and our son was strapped into the back seat. It was late afternoon, with the sky still bright enough to see well, but beginning its slow fade towards dusk. The air outside looked crisp and clear, and I could see the long stretch of the empty road ahead as we approached a more wooded area. I've driven that route more times than I can count, so I know every curve and dip. Back then, I was a sub-officer stationed in the area, and that little highway was as familiar as my own driveway. But on that particular day, everything felt just a little off. It wasn't anything huge at first, just that sense that something's not right. My wife even asked if I felt weird because I had slowed down a bit more than usual, and I remember saying something like, just keeping an eye out for moose, which is pretty common around there. But deep down, I knew I was scanning the road for something else. I just didn't know what. Then, out of nowhere, I noticed movement at the edge of the trees on the left side of the road. It was tall, at least 7 or 8 feet, and covered in dark, shaggy hair, like a large, long-limbed figure. Honestly, I thought it might be a bear standing on its hind legs at first, because bears do that sometimes. But this thing moved across the asphalt in just a few steps, long, confident strides, swinging its arms in a way that immediately struck me as too human-like. It crossed from left to right in front of my headlights, though it was still bright enough to see without them, then slipped back into the brush on the other side, heading towards a river we knew ran behind the tree line there. I slammed the brakes, and the car skidded a bit. My wife gasped, and my son yelled from the back, asking what just happened. I remember my heart pounding like I had just run a mile flat out. In those few seconds, I struggled to understand what I saw. We know how bears move. We see them often enough up here. This wasn't that. This creature was upright and had a smooth, purposeful gait. A bear, even when it stands, is awkward and heavy on its hind legs. This thing looked like it was meant to walk upright. My wife was asking me, what was that? Over and over. I couldn't give her a straight answer. I just told her I didn't know. We sat there for maybe half a minute, engine idling, not sure what to do. Part of me wanted to just drive home and never talk about it. Another part of me was too curious. Eventually, I pulled over to the side. I took a deep breath and decided to get out and look around. My wife didn't like the idea, but I think we both knew we'd regret not checking at least for tracks. The air felt cooler outside, and the silence was unsettling. No wind, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just the distant sound of trickling water and my own footsteps on gravel. I approached the spot where the creature had crossed. The roadside dirt was soft and a bit damp, perfect for holding impressions. At first I only saw some faint smudges in the mud. Then I saw them. Footprints. They were strange, kind of large, and angled slightly inward, like pigeon-toed. They looked nothing like a human's footprints, but they also weren't the prints of any animal I knew. They were long and had what appeared to be toes, but not in a shape I could easily make sense of. I knelt down and just stared at them, trying to process what I was seeing. My wife called out quietly, asking if I found anything, and I told her yes, but not to come too close because I wanted to keep the area undisturbed. I remember running my fingers lightly along the edge of the print, feeling how deep it was pressed into the mud. Whatever made these tracks was heavy, heavier than a man of my size, and I'm not small. The stride between the prints was long, too long to be a normal human's. It gave me chills. I stood up and looked toward the trees. The light was fading, the branches creating this sort of layered darkness. I knew something was out there, but I couldn't see any movement. The thought that it might be watching from behind those trunks made my stomach twist. I didn't want to be there any longer than I had to be. I went back to the car, and my wife had locked the doors. She rolled down the window just a crack and asked, "Did you see something?" I just told her about the footprints, and the look in her eyes told me she believed me. Our son was strangely quiet in the back seat, almost like he understood something serious was happening and he shouldn't ask too many questions. We talked about going back into the woods to follow the tracks, but that was a short, nervous conversation. Neither of us wanted to risk meeting whatever that was face to face again. The thought of it, this tall, hair-covered being lurking out there, was enough to freeze our blood. We decided to just keep going, to head home and try to make sense of it later. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd left something unresolved, as if we had turned our backs on a big secret the forest was holding. The drive home was silent. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see something darting across the road behind us, or maybe moving along the tree line. But there was nothing. The world around us was just as it always was. Long stretches of quiet road, tall pines, distant mountains, all bathed in that pale Alaskan twilight. Yet it felt like we had crossed a line. Before that day, I thought I knew what roamed our forests. Bears, moose, wolves, nothing we couldn't understand or explain. After that day, I knew there were things out there I couldn't fit into any category, things that made me question what I'd always assumed to be true. When we finally got home, we put our son to bed, and my wife and I just sat at the kitchen table in silence. Neither of us knew how to start talking about what we saw, so we mostly didn't. Eventually, we tried to reason it out. Maybe some guy in a ghillie suit playing a prank, maybe some strange trick of the light. But we both knew deep down that none of that felt right. Whatever we saw moved too naturally, too smoothly to be a clumsy hoax. And those footprints, it would take a master sculptor to fake something like that in the brief time we had looked away. We agreed not to mention it to others, not just because we were worried they'd think we were crazy, but because we didn't know how to put it into words without sounding insane. Over the years, I've heard whispers, stories told late at night about strange sightings in the Alaskan woods. But no one ever came forward with something that matched exactly what we saw. We never heard of anyone else finding footprints like the ones we found. I guess that's what keeps it so fresh in my mind. This wasn't some legendary story I picked up from a stranger. It was ours. It was real, and it still makes my skin crawl. I think the hardest part is that there's no closure. There was no big ending, no second sighting, no confrontation. We saw it, we found its tracks, and then it vanished back into the wilderness as if it had never been there at all. We just drove away, went home, and pretended nothing happened. To this day, I can't explain it. When I pass that stretch of road, even now, I find myself slowing down, looking into the trees, wondering if it's still out there, or if it ever was. It's like we caught a glimpse of something we weren't supposed to see, and then the forest swallowed it whole. I'm not here to convince anyone. I know what we saw, and my wife knows too. We've never forgotten it. That day changed the way I see the world around me, especially those quiet stretches of woods that seem so ordinary. Behind every line of trees, there might be something waiting, something we don't have a name for, something that can cross a road in 3 steps and disappear without a sound. I think that's what scares me the most, that we're not on the top of the food chain out there, and we're not always alone, even when we think we are. That's it, really. I still don't know what to call it. I still don't know why we saw it. Maybe it was a one-time thing, a strange encounter that will never repeat itself. Or maybe it's still out there, crossing roads in the fading daylight, leaving weird footprints in the mud. I can't say for sure. All I know is that for one brief moment in 1997, just outside Delta Junction, we saw something that shouldn't exist. And then, just like that, it was gone. Story 7. I remember it was late August of 1997, and I was out near the Goldstream area, not too far from Fairbanks, Alaska. I was hunting at the time, but not in any intense expedition way, just out there to track some game. I'd set up a makeshift camp in a small side valley, away from the main trails. I had no tent with me because the weather was relatively clear that night, and I wanted to travel light. I know it sounds stupid now, but I liked feeling closer to the environment, felt more in tune with what I was doing. That night, I was lying on my back, staring at the faint glow of stars, trying to ignore the mosquito bites that were driving me crazy. There was this kind of heavy silence around me. I'm used to the quiet of the outdoors, but this was different. It felt like the land itself was holding its breath. After a while, I managed to drift off, not into a deep sleep, but that kind of half-sleep where you're still aware of the slightest noise. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I couldn't tell you the exact time, I woke up with this weird feeling. It was like my body knew something was off before my brain caught up. The forest around me was unnaturally still. No wind, no rustling of leaves, no distant animal calls. Just stillness. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe I'd just had a bad dream or something. But then I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. Not the quick padding of a fox, not the crunch of a bear's paw, and definitely not the light scampering of a squirrel or a hare. These steps sounded like something big walking on two legs. They circled around me, a cautious, steady rhythm. The hairs on my arms stood straight up. I've heard bears plenty of times, and I know the pattern of their gait. I know how they sound when they move through brush or pass near camp. This was different, more like a person's steps, but heavier and slower. It was as if someone was studying me, trying not to get too close, but curious enough to circle around my camp. My heart was pounding so hard that I could feel it in my throat. I lay there, pretending I was still asleep, peeking just slightly to see if I could make anything out. It was too dark, and my eyes weren't adjusted well enough to make sense of any shape in that darkness. The footsteps kept going, maybe 3 or 4 times around, not in a perfect circle, but drifting in and out, sometimes closer, sometimes farther. If it had been a person, they would have said something, coughed, called out. But this thing, whatever it was, remained silent, except for its deliberate footfalls. I started thinking about the old stories. I don't know why my mind went there, but I'd heard indigenous legends and even some local rumors of hairy humanoid creatures roaming these remote areas. I always brushed them off as nonsense, just tall tales to give tourists a scare or entertain kids. But lying there in the darkness, something about those stories felt suddenly very real. My mouth went dry, and I remember my gut twisting in a way I'd never felt before. I'm not a jumpy guy. I've been face to face with bears. I've had moose charge me. But this was a whole different kind of fear. This fear was primal. It was the fear of something that shouldn't exist walking around my camp in the middle of the night. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and my ears strained to catch any hint of movement. I thought maybe it was gone, but then I realized it had just paused. I could sense it still out there, like it was listening to me, waiting for a reaction. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to do something, anything to break that tension. So, in a shaky voice, one that sounded weaker than I intended, I spoke out loud. I said something like, "I mean no harm. Let's keep it peaceful, please." The moment those words left my lips, I regretted it, because I half expected whatever was out there to respond in some horrible voice. But nothing like that happened. Instead, after a short, tense pause, I heard a rush of movement. Heavy steps moving away, down the slope, further into the darkness. They were fast but controlled, and soon I was left alone with just my own pounding heart. I didn't sleep at all after that. I just lay there, gripping my sleeping bag, scanning the dark tree line, trying to spot any shape or silhouette. But all I got was darkness and silence again. When the first light of dawn showed up, I felt a wave of relief. Normally, I would have gotten up early to look for tracks, try to make sense of what came by. But this time, I couldn't bring myself to do it. It's hard to explain, but I just didn't want to know. I didn't want to see footprints that would confirm the impossible. It was easier to leave it as a strange, terrifying memory than to find solid evidence that might haunt me for the rest of my life. So I packed up my stuff quietly, feeling that uneasy weight in my chest. I took one last look at the spot where I'd slept, and everything looked normal. Just dirt, leaves, and the scattered remains of my small camp. If anyone else had been there, they'd say nothing strange ever happened. But I knew better. That place that morning held a secret I didn't dare touch. I left the valley without telling anyone what I'd experienced. I've kept this to myself for a long time, just occasionally mentioning that I once had a weird night out there. But the truth is, I still think about it. The way those footsteps sounded, the silence that came with them, the feeling of being studied by something that wasn't supposed to exist. Even now, I get chills remembering it. I never saw a face or a silhouette. I never found proof, and I'm not entirely sure I want to. There are things out in those wild places that we don't fully understand. Maybe we never will. That night taught me something. The forest holds secrets, and sometimes, if you're unlucky, you come face to face with them, or at least close enough to hear them circle you in the dark. I never went back to that exact spot. I guess I respect the mystery too much, or I'm just plain scared. Either way, it happened, and I can still feel the weight of it. The memory lingers, and I have no explanation. It came and went, just like that, leaving me with this uneasy feeling and the understanding that some encounters are better left alone. That's all I can really say about it. It happened, and then it stopped, and I'll never forget it. Story 8. Back in 1984, I was part of a small group of soldiers, about a dozen of us, stationed in Alaska for a winter training exercise near the Black Rapids Glacier. I remember that day vividly because until then, I never thought I'd witness something that would shake my understanding of what's out there. But it happened, and even now I don't have a solid explanation for it. It was a clear day, which was a bit of a relief since the weather out there could turn nasty fast. We were camped out in this rocky, mountainous area, surrounded by snow and ice in every direction. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you uneasy when you're out in the wilderness. Nothing but the distant sound of wind scraping across ice and the occasional creak of our gear. We were outside our tents, a few of us prepping equipment, a couple guys boiling water, and others standing around trying to stay warm. I remember scanning the area, looking out toward the base of this slope that rose sharply on one side of our camp. The snow there was untouched, a bright white sheet, except for a few jagged rocks poking out. Everything around us felt still. That's when I saw it, or rather, something. At first I couldn't tell exactly what I was looking at. There was a dark figure moving way out in the distance. It was far enough away that it was hard to get a clear read on its size, but something about the way it moved grabbed my attention. It was upright, not crouched like a bear or anything like that. It it strode on two legs, taking these long, confident steps across the snow. It wasn't lumbering or clumsy. It moved smoothly, like it was completely at home out there, crossing that field of snow as if it were nothing. I called out to the others, pointing toward the slope. Soon, all of us were staring at this thing. At first, we tried to rationalize it. Could it be a person? Maybe a lost hiker or a local out checking traps? But we were in the middle of a pretty remote area, and the conditions weren't kind to anyone just wandering around. Besides, there was something about its shape, broader, taller, darker, than any normal human figure I'd ever seen bundled up in cold weather gear. It just didn't look right. One of the guys, who had grown up hearing local stories, he'd mentioned something once about the hairy man legends, started muttering under his breath. I remember feeling my heart rate pick up. You could sense a sort of tension growing among us. We were trained soldiers, and yet there we stood, squinting through the bright glare of snow, none of us wanting to say what we were all thinking. As it moved closer to the rocks near the base of that rocky slope, we got a slightly better look. It was definitely large, tall, bulky, covered in what seemed like dark hair. We didn't see any gear, no bright colors that human winter clothing tends to have. It didn't stop or slow down, it just kept moving steadily. We all stood there, not sure if we should grab our rifles or just keep watching. There was this heavy feeling in my stomach, part fear, part confusion. We had no instructions for something like this. We were out there training for survival in harsh conditions, not expecting to run into anything so out of place. Within what felt like a minute, maybe two, the figure reached a cluster of large rocks at the bottom of the slope. The creature slipped between them, and just like that, it vanished. 1 second it was there, this undeniable presence cutting across the whiteness of the snow, and the next, it was gone. We waited for it to reappear on the other side, but it never did. One of the guys walked a few steps forward as if he were going to try to follow, but he stopped. Nobody wanted to go closer. The air felt charged, like we'd seen something we weren't supposed to. We started talking in hushed voices, trying to piece together what we'd just witnessed. A couple of us whispered about the old stories, hairy creatures out in the wilds of Alaska that people hardly ever see but talk about sometimes, usually half in jest. I remember feeling sweat trickling down my neck despite the cold. It wasn't like seeing a bear or even a wolf. This felt entirely different. I'd seen bears before, and they don't move like that. They don't have that human-like stride. And a person that big, moving like that, way out here, it didn't add up. After a while we just stood there, scanning the area with binoculars, trying to find tracks or any sign of movement. The snow was too far away, and the terrain too tricky to get a good look without actually going there. And none of us had the guts to go investigate. We were trained for a lot of things, but chasing after a mysterious, possibly dangerous creature in the remote Alaskan wilderness wasn't on our list. We spent the rest of the day on edge, wondering if it would come back, or if we'd hear something. Heavy footsteps, strange calls, anything. But the silence remained. The more we talked about it, the more unsettled we became. Some of the guys tried to dismiss it as an odd-looking bear or even a trick of the light, but I could tell they didn't believe themselves. We all knew what we saw wasn't normal. It walked too purposefully, too smoothly, and bears don't just vanish like that behind some rocks and never reappear. We didn't mention it to the officers in any official capacity. This was back in the mid-80s, and none of us wanted to be labeled as the guy who swore he saw a Bigfoot or something insane like that. But among ourselves, we kept talking about it well into the night, huddled in the tents. Some of the guys even thought about packing up early, but we had a schedule to maintain. Still, I doubt any of us slept well that night, each lost in our own thoughts, replaying that strange figure over and over again. To this day, I have no explanation. I don't know what we saw. It's not like I've devoted my life to Bigfoot research or anything like that, but I've never been able to shake that image. I remember the exact angle of the sunlight, the crispness of the air, the burn in my lungs from breathing that cold Alaskan wind, and that dark shape against the snow. It never came back that I know of. We finished our training, packed up, and left. None of us ever got a satisfactory answer. But I know what I saw wasn't a trick of my imagination. We all saw it, and it left us shaken and full of questions. I'm still bothered by it sometimes, wondering what could survive out there, how it could remain so hidden. It's been decades, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. I have nothing to prove and no reason to make this up. It happened, and then it ended, leaving us with nothing but uneasy memories and a permanent sense of uncertainty. Story 9. I still remember that day as clearly as if it happened last week, even though it's been decades. It was 1964, and I was not too far from Healey, Alaska. I'd headed out before dawn, hoping to track a caribou or maybe a moose. The sky was dull gray and heavy with a lingering cold that settled right into my bones. I was young but not inexperienced. I'd been hunting since I was a teenager, and I knew these woods well enough. I carried my rifle and had a pistol on my hip, though I rarely needed it. Back then, the forest still felt untouched, remote, like you could vanish in there, and no one would know any better. I remember trudging through a stretch of brush that morning, my boots sinking slightly into damp patches of moss. The silence felt almost oppressive. Sure, you'd hear the occasional bird or the rustling of small critters, but there was something off about that quiet. It made me uneasy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I tried to shrug that feeling off, telling myself maybe I just hadn't seen any game yet. Maybe I was just jumpy because it was colder than usual, and I was stiff from the long walk. At some point, I stopped to adjust the strap on my rifle. I'd been hiking for at least a couple of hours and hadn't spotted anything worth following. Suddenly, I noticed a shape out of the corner of my eye. It was tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet, covered in dark, shaggy hair. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, maybe a stump partially hidden by thick branches. But then it moved. It stepped forward, and I could see its silhouette clearly against the sparse trees. I can't stress enough how unusual this was. I'd seen bears stand on their hind legs, and this wasn't that. Its proportions were all wrong. The arms were too long, and it was just standing there, not like an animal that blunders into your path, but like something observing me. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat. I remember gripping my rifle tighter, my knuckles going white, but I also remember a weird calm, as if some part of me refused to believe what I was seeing. We stood there, facing each other, maybe 15 or 20 yards apart. The thing, I still hate calling it the thing because it makes me sound like I'm making this up, emitted a low grunt, not a growl, not a roar, just a quiet grunt, as if acknowledging my presence. It didn't bare teeth or charge, it just let out that sound and tilted its head slightly, almost curious. I didn't shoot. I know that might sound crazy, but it never felt right to raise my weapon. It felt like I was looking at something that shouldn't exist, but there it was, calmly sizing me up. Then, as silently as it appeared, it backed away. It moved so smoothly that I didn't even hear the brush rustle much. Within seconds, it was gone, blending into the dark trunks and thick undergrowth. I was left standing there, rifle in hand, heart still thumping, more confused than scared. But the fear did come, just a few moments later, when my brain started catching up to what I'd just witnessed. I'll never forget what happened next. Just as I turned to head back towards my car, an old blue truck parked by a dirt road a good hike away, I started hearing faint cracks and snaps in the distance, twigs or branches, but not the regular forest sounds. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic, like something following me at a distance. I tried to keep my breathing steady, telling myself it was just a deer, a moose, something that got curious about my scent. But the pattern of the sound felt unnatural. It would follow me for a bit, then stop. Then when I moved again, it would start up again in a different spot, always out of sight, always just far enough that I couldn't see anything clearly. The further I walked, the more uneasy I felt. I kept glancing over my shoulder. I'd catch a flicker of movement, maybe a branch swaying in a way that didn't match the breeze. I wanted to pick up my pace, but I also didn't want to trigger anything by looking like prey. I remember feeling the cold sweat trickle down my back. My mouth was dry, and I couldn't stop that tightening knot in my stomach. The silence from before was gone. Now the forest felt alive with things I couldn't see, pressing in on me from all sides. Eventually, I reached a small clearing, and through the trees I could see the outline of my truck. Relief washed over me. I thought if I could just get to it, I'd be safe. I quickened my steps, my boots crunching leaves and snapping thin twigs, not even caring if I was making noise. As I neared the vehicle, the noises in the woods got quieter, as if whatever it was lost interest or decided not to get any closer to the road. I could feel eyes on me, though. That's something I'll never be able to properly describe. Just that sense that something is watching you, measuring you, from a place just beyond your line of sight. When I finally swung open the door and climbed in, I felt a surge of relief. But before I started the engine, I took a moment to calm myself. I looked around through the windshield and the side mirrors, searching the tree line. I spotted nothing, no movement, no tall figure stepping out from behind the trunks. I expected something, at least a glimpse of fur or those eyes, but the woods looked empty, just ordinary trees with patches of snow and dead leaves. I turned the ignition and started back towards town. The drive was quiet. I rolled down the window a bit, hoping the fresh air would help me clear my head. Part of me wanted to tell someone as soon as I got back, my father maybe, who taught me how to hunt. But I knew how it would sound. We all heard campfire stories about strange creatures up in the mountains, but I was never one to believe in that. And now I was stuck, knowing what I saw and having no way to prove it. For weeks after, I replayed the scene in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see that figure standing there, silent and cautious. I could hear that low grunt. I remembered how it didn't feel violent, but it also didn't feel like any ordinary animal. It just felt off. Sometimes I convinced myself it was a trick of the light, maybe a bear with some strange posture, or a hunter wearing a heavy fur coat, though what kind of person would stare at me like that and then vanish without a sound? Even now, after all these years, I can't fully explain what I saw. I know the region around Healey had its share of odd stories. Hunters and hikers talking about large, hairy things in the woods, always half seen and never confirmed. Back then, I brushed most of those stories off. Now I'm not so sure. I don't want to call it anything specific, but I know what it looked like, and I know how it made me feel, like I was stepping into a world I wasn't supposed to see, even for a second. That day still lingers in my memory. I don't have any neat explanation or a thrilling conclusion. It happened. It scared me in ways I never thought possible. And then it ended. I drove home, kept quiet, and moved on with my life. But that feeling never really left. I still wonder if it's still out there, watching from behind the trees, silent and impossible. I guess I'll never know. Story 10. Back in July 2009, I was driving home in Fairbanks, Alaska, just as the sun was dipping low enough to turn the sky into that weird half-light we get up here in the summer. It was still bright enough to see, but it felt like things were starting to hide in the long shadows. I was on a familiar route, a road I'd driven countless times before. It's a quiet, wooded area with a few houses spaced out and a small community school not too far off. There's even a garden someone keeps up near one of the homes, nothing out of the ordinary. I was tired, just wanting to get back home, maybe heat something up for dinner and call it a night. I remember my headlights catching something on the side of the road. At first I thought it was just a guy standing there. That didn't make much sense, though. He was just off the edge of the pavement, near some thin brush, like he was waiting for someone or maybe hitchhiking. But there was something off about the shape. I slowed down because instinctively, when you see someone weird like that, you just go slower. The figure wasn't right. The shoulders were broad, and I couldn't see the outline of clothes the way you'd expect. It looked like it was covered in some kind of reddish-brown hair, not like a fur coat or something, but like actual hair, thick and uneven, and it stood about my height, maybe a bit taller, so around 6 feet. Definitely not a bear standing on hind legs, though that thought flickered in my mind for half a second. My heart kicked up a notch when I realized this wasn't a person in normal clothes. I wasn't sure what the hell I was looking at. The headlights sort of illuminated it, but not perfectly, and everything felt oddly quiet. I could swear I even turned down the radio without realizing it, just to focus on whatever this thing was. As I rolled closer, it turned its head toward me. That's when I got the worst chill down my spine. Its face wasn't exactly like a human's. I only saw it for a moment, maybe a second or two, but the features were off. The eyes reflected the headlights in a weird way, kind of like how animals' eyes do at night. Its nose and mouth were more human than an animal's, but covered in that rust-colored hair, and it looked startled. The damn thing looked surprised to see me, which only made me feel more uneasy. Before I could really grasp what I was seeing, it moved. Fast. It darted into the trees with a kind of quick, fluid motion you'd never expect from something that looked so solid. The brush shook a little, and then it was gone. I was left sitting there in my car, engine running, headlights cutting through empty air. I pulled over completely and just sat there, breathing heavily and trying to understand what happened. I even got out of the car, which looking back might have been really stupid, but I just had to see if it was still there. The place where it stood was just a patch of ground, some low brush, nothing special. The trees weren't thick right there, just a few pines and some birches. On the other side, I could still see the school building in the distance, and near it, this little garden area. It's not like it could have just vanished into thin air. Everything was fairly open. I should have been able to see it running off, or at least hear it crashing through the undergrowth. But I heard nothing. It was dead quiet, the kind of silence that makes you suddenly aware of your own breathing. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I remember my hands were shaking. I tried to calm myself down by reasoning. Maybe I was tired. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe just some guy wearing a strange outfit. But deep down, I knew that wasn't just a person in a weird costume. I've seen moose, bears, foxes, all kinds of animals up here, and I'm no stranger to how they move. This was different. This was bipedal. It stood upright like a man, but it was covered in hair and moved too smoothly. It didn't lumber. It didn't panic. It just moved as if it belonged there, and I was the one intruding. After a few minutes that felt like hours, I got back into my car and drove the rest of the way home, checking my rearview mirror more times than I can count. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see that face, that startled, almost intelligent look in its eyes before it bolted off. I kept telling myself I must have been mistaken. But what the hell could I have mistaken it for? A few days later, I worked up the courage to mention it to some neighbors and a couple of local folks who've been in Fairbanks longer than I have. I tried to be casual about it, like, "Hey, you ever see anything weird around the wooded areas by the school?" I got some strange looks, but then a couple of them gave me these guarded, knowing glances. One woman said she'd heard stories from her dad about something roaming around the outskirts of town, something people didn't like to talk about because it sounded too crazy. Another guy told me he once saw something vaguely human-like running off near his backyard one late evening, but he didn't want to go into detail. The look on his face said he believed me even if he wouldn't say so outright. I never got a firm explanation. Nobody admitted to seeing exactly what I saw, but the way they reacted told me I wasn't completely nuts. Over time, I tried to brush it off, but the memory of that creature watching me before it disappeared into the trees still messes with my head. I never saw it again, and I still drive that same route sometimes. Every time I pass that spot, I can't help but glance at the side of the road, at those thin trees, half expecting to see it again, half hoping I never do. To this day, I don't know what it was. Some kind of animal, a stray bear with a bizarre coat, something else entirely. I've heard of people claiming to see Bigfoot, and I always thought that was ridiculous. Still do, mostly. But whatever I saw, it shouldn't have been there, and it certainly shouldn't have looked right at me the way it did. Maybe it was something totally explainable, but then why does the memory still feel so damn unsettling? All these years later, I have no more answers than I did that day. I never reported it to the authorities because, come on, who would take that seriously? It's just one of those things I can't shake off. Every so often, especially when the nights grow long up here, I think back on that moment. The quiet road, the reddish hair, those reflective eyes, and how it vanished into nothing. I've learned to just accept that I might never understand what happened out there. It was a brief, terrifying glimpse into something that doesn't fit neatly into what I know of the world. And maybe that's the scariest part. Knowing it happened, it was real to me. And yet I'll probably never be able to explain it to anyone in a way that makes sense. It just ended as suddenly as it began, and I'm left with nothing but that uneasy memory. Story 11. It was late evening in early October of 1992, and I remember the cold creeping in through the car windows as we made our way back from Anchorage to Fairbanks. I was sitting in the passenger seat, trying to stay awake, half focused on the dark shapes of tall trees rushing by. My friend was driving. He was tired too, and we had been on the road for hours, occasionally trading small talk, but mostly just pushing through the long miles. The silence outside felt heavier than usual. There were barely any other cars that night, and the darkness seemed thicker than I was used to. We were somewhere near Canwell, on a stretch of road that didn't seem too different from the rest. Tall pines on both sides, the asphalt just a narrow grey ribbon under the faint glow of our headlights. As we rounded a gentle curve, the headlights caught something crouched right on the center line. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It looked like an animal, but not one that belonged here. My eyes struggled to adjust. I even blinked a few times, thinking maybe I was just so tired that my mind was playing tricks. My friend slowed down immediately, and the car's high beams fell directly onto this figure. It was squatting low, like it was examining something on the asphalt. In that first split second, my initial thought, completely ridiculous now, was that it might be an orangutan. I know that sounds insane, but that was the image that popped into my head, a large, reddish, ape-like creature. But we were in Alaska, for God's sake. There are moose, bears, wolves, not orangutans. As we got closer, the thing began to straighten up. I remember that motion very clearly. It wasn't the jerky movement of a startled animal like a deer. It was smooth and deliberate, almost too calm. Its body unfurled upward until it stood on two legs, towering above the yellow line. The headlights lit up long reddish-brown hair that covered its entire body. The hair wasn't like a bear's. It seemed longer in some places, almost matted in spots. The shoulders were broad, impossibly wide, and the silhouette was definitely more human-like than I could accept in that moment. My heart was slamming in my chest. I could hear my friend's breathing change. He kind of made a quiet, shaky sound, as if he wanted to say something but couldn't. For maybe 2 or 3 seconds, we were just frozen. I didn't dare move. I barely breathed. I remember feeling this surge of absolute confusion and fear. It felt like I was looking at something I wasn't supposed to see, like I'd stumbled into some secret the wilderness was trying to keep. The creature's face was partially in shadow, but I could see enough to tell it wasn't a bear. The head was shaped differently, the shoulders slumped forward like a powerful man might stand, and its arms were long, hanging in a way that didn't seem natural for a person. It stood there, fully upright, and I realized it was massive. I don't know how tall exactly, but definitely larger than any human I've ever seen. Its presence was overwhelming, almost suffocating, even though it was just standing there in the middle of the road. Then, so abruptly that it made me jerk in my seat, the thing leaned forward and took off. It didn't run clumsily, didn't drop to all fours, just sprinted into the brush on the side of the road. I caught a glimpse of its back, the way the hair shifted with its movement, and how silently it vanished. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, swallowed by the darkness and the dense vegetation. My friend didn't move at first. The car was barely rolling at that point, and I had to tell him to drive, to get us moving again. My voice sounded strange, even to me, quieter, shakier than I expected. He hit the gas, and we continued down the road, not saying a word for a few minutes. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see it standing behind the car or running alongside us through the trees. But there was nothing, just the endless blur of blackness and the reflection of our taillights on the asphalt. Eventually, when I felt my heart settle a bit, I asked my friend, "Did you see that?" And he just nodded, eyes locked on the road, knuckles white on the steering wheel. Neither of us wanted to voice what we were thinking. We had no explanation for what just happened. How do you articulate something that doesn't fit into anything you know? I kept playing the image back in my mind, the shape of its shoulders, the thickness of its arms, the way it stood there as if it belonged right where it was, as if we were the ones intruding. We drove on, and after a while, we pulled into a small gas station that was still open. I remember the fluorescent lights over the pumps buzzing quietly. We stepped out into the cold air and looked around nervously. It felt like we were checking to make sure the thing hadn't followed us. Inside the little store, the cashier gave us a nod but didn't say much. I thought about asking him if anyone else had ever reported seeing something strange out there, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. It felt too weird to say out loud, and I was worried he'd think we were crazy. We fueled up, grabbed some coffee, and got back in the car. The rest of the drive to Fairbanks passed in tense silence. I remember every time we passed a darker patch of trees, I'd half expect to see those eyes reflecting back at me, that massive shape stepping into the headlights again. It never did. I know what I saw wasn't normal. There's no way it was a local animal, no escaped zoo creature that someone just forgot to mention. It stood like a man, moved like something used to these woods, and vanished without a sound. To this day, I don't have a neat explanation. My friend and I talked about it a few times afterward, but we never settled on what it could have been. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, some unknown primate, whatever people want to call it. I still remember the way my stomach dropped when it stood up, and how my mind went blank trying to classify what I was looking at. Over the years, I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe it was a hunter in a strange outfit. Maybe I was just exhausted. But none of those explanations hold up, not when I recall the sheer size of it, the way it just stared back at us with what felt like a challenge or confusion in its posture. And then it was gone, and we were left with no evidence except our own memories. I've never seen anything like it since, and I've never gotten a satisfying answer. Whatever it was, it stopped me in my tracks and forced me to acknowledge that there might be things out there that don't fit neatly into what we understand. It's been decades, and I still get chills when I think of that night near Canwell. Sometimes I wish I had never seen it, because then I wouldn't be stuck wondering what the hell we encountered on that stretch of dark Alaskan highway. But I did see it, and I'll never forget it. Story 12. I remember it was late November 2000, a Sunday morning if I'm not mistaken. My son was about 9 back then, and we were out by Beaver Lake near Garfield, Arkansas. I had this hobby of looking for old arrowheads whenever the lake's water was low. The sediment and sand sometimes revealed surprises you'd never see otherwise. My son loved tagging along, and we took our terrier with us. Just a little dog, only about 20 pounds, but he was feisty and usually fearless. It was a sunny day, surprisingly warm for that time of year. I remember wearing a light jacket and taking it off after a while because I got comfortable enough in just a flannel shirt. We were slowly walking along the edge of the lake, mostly focused on the ground beneath our feet. I'd found a broken arrowhead tip the week before, so I had high hopes. The lake level was low, and the exposed sand stretched out farther than usual. We followed some raccoon tracks for a bit, just as a little side interest. I was showing my son how to identify the shape of their paws when pressed into damp ground. It's something he always found neat, seeing the signs of wildlife you rarely got to witness directly. At one point, we came across something that instantly made me pause. There, in the soft sand, I saw 2 sets of footprints. I don't mean human footprints like we'd leave, and I don't mean anything like what a bear or a large cat would leave behind. These were different. They were shaped more or less like big human feet, with a rough outline of toes, but they were huge and deep. One set had prints that looked around, I'd guess, 16 inches long, massive compared to my own boot prints. The other set was smaller, but still much larger than any normal human foot I'd ever seen. They ran parallel to each other, as if 2 individuals, whatever they were, had walked side by side along the shore. I stood there trying to make sense of it. There weren't any boot treads, no hint of a shoe. It looked like something barefoot, something heavy. And the depth of the impression in the sand was striking. I pushed down with my own boot, trying to see how deep I could go. I couldn't get close to that depth. Whoever or whatever made those prints had to be extremely heavy. It's not like the sand was that soft. It was damp but firm. And there were no other human tracks anywhere, just these 2 sets moving in a fairly straight line. My son got quiet. Usually he'd be asking 100 questions, but he just stared, trying to understand. I remember him looking up at me with this confused, uneasy expression. I tried to maintain a calm tone, suggesting maybe some large animal had come through here. He asked what kind of animal could have feet like a person. I had no answer that made sense. While we were examining these prints, my dog started whining. This was odd, because he was the type of dog to bark at strangers, chase squirrels, and he never backed down from a raccoon or even a snake. But at that moment, he tucked his tail between his legs and started making these uneasy little sounds. He peed right there on the sand, a nervous reaction he rarely had, and then tried to paw at the sand as if to bury something. It wasn't like he was digging for a smell. It was more like he wanted to cover the footprints, as if they offended him or scared him so much he didn't want to see them. There was something in the air. I can't explain it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I got this strong feeling that we were being watched. Not just the general sense of being in nature and knowing animals are around, but a more intense feeling, as if eyes were on us. I found myself looking over my shoulder, scanning the tree line. The area was pretty open, and I didn't see anything moving among the brush. No deer, no other hikers, nothing. Just silence, except for the occasional lap of the lake water. I tried to calm down and think logically. Maybe some prankster carved these prints, or it was some weird, oversized boot with a bare footprint shape. But I'd never heard of anyone doing something like that around here. And if it were a prank, there'd have been some clue, some pattern or tool marks. These looked natural, like actual feet had pressed into that sand. I bent down to get a closer look at the bigger set. I could make out where the toes had pushed in, how the ball of the foot was deeper, how the heel left a rounded impression. That kind of detail would be hard to fake perfectly. My heart was pounding. I felt unsettled, like I was at the edge of something I didn't want to think about. My son asked if we could go back. He said he didn't like it there. That was enough for me. I decided it was probably best not to linger. As we turned to leave, my dog let out a low, worried growl, staring toward a cluster of bushes about 30 yards away. I couldn't see anything there, but he was fixated. I called him, gave a slight tug on his leash, and he followed, but I could feel his tension through the leash, like a tremor. All the way back, I kept replaying the scene in my head. The size, the depth, that strange parallel track of footprints disappearing up toward the brush line. What the hell made them? And why had my dog reacted like that? My son asked if I'd ever heard of something like Bigfoot, but I was never the type to believe in those stories. I tried to reassure him that maybe it was just something we didn't understand, maybe a weird deformation in the ground, or large animals leaving strange overlapping prints that looked human by coincidence. But inside, I knew that didn't match what we saw. When we finally got back to the spot where our car was parked, I realized we had no camera with us that day. This was 2000. I didn't carry a cell phone with a camera. We'd brought nothing to document it, just our memory. Part of me was relieved. Something about having photographic evidence of those tracks felt wrong, like I'd be inviting more questions than answers. Another part of me regretted not having some proof, because it was such a bizarre thing to witness. I never reported it. I didn't know who to tell. The local newspaper wouldn't care, and I didn't want people thinking I was a crackpot. I told a few close friends and they shrugged it off, saying maybe I misread what I saw. But I know what I saw. Those were footprints, really big footprints, and there were two sets, side by side, as if two massive human-like creatures had walked along Beaver Lake's shore that morning, leaving those impossible tracks behind. It's been years, and even now I get chills recalling the details. That day was otherwise ordinary. I've never seen anything like it since. The dog lived for several more years, and he never behaved that way again in any other situation. My son and I went back a couple of times to look for arrowheads in the following months, but we never found anything that strange again. The prints were gone, washed away by weather, replaced by fresh sediment. It's like it never happened, but I know it happened. I felt it. I saw how my dog reacted. I saw the look on my son's face, that honest confusion and fear you can't fake. To this day, I can't explain it. I still think about those footprints sometimes and wonder if something was watching us back then, lurking just beyond the tree line, leaving no other trace but those heavy steps in the sand. I can't say what it was, and I won't pretend to know. But I'll never forget how it made me feel. Like I'd stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see, something that shouldn't have been there, but somehow it was. And then, just like that, we left. And life went on as if nothing had happened. But I remember. I'll always remember. Story 13. Back in 2005, we were living on a small piece of land a few miles outside of Kingston, Arkansas. It was a clear night. I remember that vividly. We had this idea of scouting out a spot on our property where we could set up a telescope in the future. We didn't own one yet, but we were excited about the idea of stargazing without all the light pollution. The area around our place was mostly quiet fields, patches of wooded hills and gravel roads. Not much happened there, and that's exactly why we'd chosen to live there. It felt safe, calm, familiar. I remember we drove our old truck down our long dirt driveway, past the shabby wooden fence we'd never gotten around to fixing. We parked at the very end of the property, a spot where the grass was shorter and the tree line was about 50 feet away. The moonlight was bright enough to see the outlines of the trees, their branches, and even some of the rocks on the ground. It was one of those nights where you could almost get around without a flashlight, but we brought one anyway. I think it made us feel a bit more secure. We stepped out, left the truck's engine off, and just listened for a moment. It was quiet, almost too quiet. No distant hum of neighbors, no cars on the back roads. We just had the subtle chirp of some insects and maybe the distant hoot of an owl. At first, it felt peaceful. I remember pointing out a spot a bit further in where the land rose slightly. My thought was that from there, we'd have a clearer view of the sky. My partner agreed, and we started walking in that direction, taking slow steps, careful not to trip on uneven ground. After maybe 5 minutes, I noticed this strange feeling creeping over me. You know when you suddenly get that instinct that you're not alone, that something is off? That's exactly what happened. It started as a low, nervous hum in my chest. I tried to brush it off, told myself we were just not used to being out that late without a purpose. But then I saw my partner's face in the moonlight. They looked uneasy, scanning the tree line like they sensed it too. Then we heard something. It was a crunch, like a heavy foot snapping a branch deep in the woods. We froze. At first we figured maybe a deer or some animal was just moving around. But then came a pattern of steps, slow and deliberate, and it sounded heavier than a deer. It wasn't just a single crack of wood. There were multiple steps, each one making this muted thud on the forest floor. I shone the flashlight toward the trees, but the beam caught nothing but dark shapes and tangled branches. The sound stopped the moment I aimed the light. I felt my stomach twist. It was as if whatever it was knew we were looking. For a second, we just stood there, straining our ears. That's when we caught the smell. I can't fully describe it, but the closest thing I can compare it to is a mix of wet dog, rotting meat, and something acidic or sulfur-like. It made me want to gag. I've smelled dead animals before. I've smelled wet fur before. But this was worse, like a heavy, foul blanket of odor that just settled around us. My partner grabbed my arm and whispered, "Do you smell that?" I just nodded, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We knew the local wildlife pretty well. Bears weren't common in that part of Arkansas at the time, and even if one were around, I don't think it would smell like that. The odor was so intense, so unsettling. I remember it almost stung my nose. I aimed the flashlight again, slowly panning across the tree line. I couldn't see anything moving, but I had this feeling that something was staring right back at us, hiding behind the brush or the trunk of a tree. Then we heard more movement. This time the steps were closer. They had this weight to them that made me think of something large, bipedal even. I know that sounds crazy, but it just didn't sound like the four-legged shuffle I'd expect from a deer or a bobcat. It was more like the sound of a heavy boot pressing into the ground, one step at a time. The crunch, pause, crunch. The smell grew stronger too, and I found myself stepping backward without even meaning to, just trying to put distance between us and whatever it was. We were terrified but somehow kept quiet, both of us trying to make sense of it. I thought about calling out, maybe yelling something like, "Hey, who's there?" But I couldn't get the words out. Something in me just knew that would be a bad idea. Instead, I tightened my grip on the flashlight and we started to back away, heading the way we came, toward the truck. We didn't turn our backs to the woods. We moved slowly, keeping the light pointed straight ahead. And as we stepped back, we could hear it follow. Not constantly. Sometimes it would move and then stop, as if it was testing us or waiting for us to mess up. The fact that it wasn't making a run at us but still keeping pace was somehow even more frightening. It felt like a game of cat and mouse, except we didn't know what the cat was. A few times I thought I saw a shape at the edge of the flashlight beam, a tall, dark figure blending with the trees, something that looked too large to be a person, at least not anyone we knew. But it never stayed in the light long enough for me to be sure. Each time I tried to focus, it would vanish behind a tree trunk or into the shadows, almost like it knew how to stay just out of view. And that smell, God, that smell was so awful. I remember breathing through my mouth, trying not to retch. We got closer to the truck. It felt like forever, even though it must have been just a minute or two. I pulled the keys from my pocket, careful not to drop them. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip them. Eventually, I felt the cool metal of the door handle under my hand, and we slipped inside as quietly as we could. I immediately hit the lock. I remember my partner flipping the headlights on, hoping maybe we'd catch a glimpse of whatever the hell had followed us. But we saw nothing, just an empty stretch of grass and the dark silhouette of the forest behind it. Sitting in that truck with the doors locked, breathing hard and feeling our hearts pound, we both looked at each other, speechless. After a few seconds, I started the engine and began to back up, headlights sweeping over the property. Nothing moved, no shape darted out of the darkness. The smell lingered in my nose, though I think it was more in my memory than actually in the truck at that point. We drove back to the house as fast as the dirt road would let us, without risking a flat tire. When we got home, we didn't sleep much. We kept replaying it in our minds, trying to figure out what it could have been. We knew the local animals, we'd heard their sounds before, and this didn't match. It was something else. Whatever it was moved like it was smart. It knew to stay just out of sight, and that smell. Nothing in my life has ever matched that smell. To this day, I can't explain it. We never saw it again after that night, and we eventually moved away a few years later. But that experience stuck with us. It was the kind of thing that made me question what's really out there in the woods. What could be lurking just beyond where our lights can reach? Even now, remembering it makes my skin crawl. I still don't know if it was some weird drifter, a strange animal, or something else entirely. I've read stories online about encounters people have had with huge ape-like creatures around the country, and it makes me wonder, did we have a run-in with something like that? All I know is, since that night, I've never felt completely at ease in the dark outdoors, no matter where I am. It taught me that there are things we don't have answers for, and that sometimes it's best not to find out. That night ended almost as suddenly as it started. No big confrontation, no final reveal. We just escaped back to the safety of our home, locked the doors, and spent the rest of the night trying to make sense of something that still haunts us today. Story 14. I remember that morning way too vividly. It was December 4th, 2005, and I was checking the southwestern corner of my property near Pelaw, Arkansas. It was around 8:15 a.m., give or take a few minutes. The sun had just started to light up the pastures, and the air was crisp but not unbearably cold. I'd gone out there because I'd noticed a few loose boards in the old fence line the day before, and I wanted to see if the deer had been using that spot to move between my land and the wooded area across the old wire fence. As I stood there, trying to gauge how much repair I'd need to do, I heard the neighbor's dogs start going crazy. They were barking non-stop, and it was one of those barks you hear when the dogs are either chasing something or about to. They weren't right on my property, but close enough that I could tell they were moving toward Highway 7, which ran not too far from where I was. Usually when I hear something like that, I figure a deer or maybe a fox spooked them. That's not uncommon around here. I decided to just stand still and keep my eyes peeled. I figured if something was moving toward my land, I'd catch a glimpse of it. The light was decent. It wasn't a bright, sunny day, but I could still see pretty well through the trees and brush. I remember the sound of the dogs fading a bit as if they had gone off chasing something out of my line of sight, and then things got oddly quiet. The birds weren't making much noise, and I noticed my own breathing became more deliberate as I tried to stay as silent as possible. I don't know why I felt tense. Maybe it's because I wasn't seeing anything, just a still patch of forest. But then I caught a slight movement. At first I thought it was just a branch swaying, maybe a squirrel. But then I saw something dark and large shifting between the branches. I stood there, squinting, and felt my heart pick up speed. The shape was tall, taller than any person I know, and definitely not shaped like a deer or a bear. I've seen bears before, and I know how they move. This was different. It moved smoothly and upright, two-legged, and it had a kind of lean yet muscular build that I've never seen on any animal around here. There was this dark hair covering it, maybe not super long fur, but definitely a thick coat of dark, almost black hair. I could make out the shoulders moving as it stepped through the brush, and the way it navigated the uneven ground and the tangled branches was almost graceful, like it knew exactly where to put its feet. I felt this cold rush of adrenaline. I wanted to yell, or maybe run back to my truck, but I also didn't want to spook it, whatever it was. So I just froze, standing among the leaf litter and old pine needles, holding my breath and trying not to make a sound. I remember my hand was shaking, and I tightened it into a fist to stop the trembling. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Could it be a hunter in a ghillie suit? But no. The proportions looked off. Long arms, a broad chest, and the legs didn't look like they were wrapped in any fabric. It didn't look human. I couldn't see the face clearly. The angle and the brush made it tough, but I did see a head shape, and I swear I saw what looked like a brow ridge and maybe deep-set eyes. The moment felt way too long and too short at the same time. I watched it step over an old wire fence that marks an older boundary on my property. One of those fences that's mostly fallen down and covered in vines. It lifted its leg and crossed it effortlessly, barely a pause. A human would have stumbled or at least hesitated. This thing didn't. It just moved, almost silently. I didn't hear heavy footsteps, just a faint rustling of leaves and the soft snap of a twig. It was quiet in a way something that big shouldn't be. After it crossed the fence line, it slipped behind a cluster of saplings and shrubs, and for a moment I lost sight of it. I crept forward a few steps, feeling my heartbeat in my throat. The silence was getting to me. The dogs had vanished from earshot, and it was like the entire area was holding its breath. When I reached the spot where I thought I'd see it again, it was just gone. There was no sign of it, no broken branches that I could tell, no footprints that I could see immediately. I felt my stomach drop. It was so strange. Something that large should have been easier to track. I scanned the tree line, my eyes flicking between the trunks and brush, expecting to see it slip away in the distance. Nothing. I stood there a good 5 minutes, just trying to process what I saw. I felt this uneasy tension in my body, like I'd just witnessed something I wasn't supposed to. My mind raced with explanations. Some wild animal out of place, a bear walking oddly on 2 legs, though that made no sense to me, or maybe a prank by some lunatic. But it didn't feel like a prank. The movements were too fluid, too natural. And that coat of dark hair. I know what a person in a suit looks like. They wouldn't blend in that smoothly with the environment. Not like this. As I looked around, I realized how quiet it still was. The forest had that strange hush, like after a predator passes. I felt a chill, even though I was wearing a decent jacket. I walked a bit closer to where it had crossed the old fence line. The fence wire was old and rusted, tangled in ivy and brush. I've tried stepping over it myself before and nearly tripped. I wanted to see if there was any sign, footprints, tufts of hair, something. But the ground was covered in damp leaves, and nothing stood out except for a few bent twigs. If there was a trail, I couldn't find it. It's like it knew exactly how to move without leaving a trace. I can't really describe the feeling that settled over me, but I'll try. It was like a mix of awe and raw fear. Not the kind of fear where you think you're about to be attacked, but the kind that comes from seeing something that doesn't fit into what you believe the world should be. I've lived on this land for years. I know the local wildlife. I know the patterns of the seasons. I've never seen anything even remotely like that. It didn't fit any category in my head. Wasn't a black bear, wasn't a person, wasn't some escaped animal from a nearby farm. None of the neighbors have exotic animals, that's for sure. It left me feeling uneasy and confused. Eventually I gave up trying to see it again. I stood there, listening for a while. But there was nothing. Just the distant hum of a car passing on Highway 7 after some time, and the quiet stirrings of birds picking back up. I headed back to my truck, keeping an eye over my shoulder the whole way. Part of me wanted to tell someone right away, but I knew how it would sound. I was a farmer who saw something big and hairy walking on two legs. People would say I was tired, or seeing things, or making it up. But I know what I saw. I know the shape, the way it moved, how it crossed that fence like it wasn't even there. To this day, I can't explain it. I've never seen it again, never found footprints or hair samples, never heard the neighbors mention anything like it. The dogs sometimes bark at night, but that's normal. I've looked online and found stories of people who claim to see things like Bigfoot, but I never took that seriously before. Now, I'm not so sure. It's been years, and I still think about that morning whenever I'm out by that old fence line. I can't give anyone a concrete explanation. It happened, and then it was over, just like that. It still bothers me because it felt so real, because it was real. Whatever that thing was, I saw it, and I've got no good explanation. It's just a memory that refuses to go away. Story 15. I remember it like it was yesterday, even though it's been decades. It was late 1979, just a few days after Hurricane Frederick had ripped through our area. We lived just outside of Semmes, Alabama. Back then, it was a lot quieter and more rural. The storm had knocked out the power, and we were still waiting for it to come back. It was late, around 11 at night, and my dad asked me to go pick up some ice from my grandparents' small shop down the dirt road. It might sound odd, sending an 11-year-old out so late, but that's how things were back then. We needed ice because the fridge wasn't working and our food was on the brink of spoiling. I remember feeling a knot in my stomach as I stepped outside. The sky was moonless, and without any lights, the darkness seemed thicker than usual. The air was still, like the whole world was holding its breath. I had a flashlight, but it was weak, one of those old ones that took forever to turn on and then barely cut through the dark. I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, and everything around me seemed strange. The storm had toppled trees and scattered debris. There were branches and leaves all over the place, and the sweet, musty smell of wet wood hung in the air. As I walked along the dirt road, I could feel the damp ground squishing under my sneakers. The crunch of gravel and the rustle of something unseen in the bushes made my heart beat faster. I tried to focus on my task, just get to my grandparents' store, grab a small block of ice, and hurry back. It was maybe a 5-minute walk at most, but each step felt like it took a lifetime. The silence pressed in, and every little sound made me tense up. After a minute or two, I noticed the neighbors' dogs. They lived a couple of properties down, and usually they barked at night. But this time, it wasn't just normal barking. It was a frantic, nervous kind of barking, like they'd spotted something that had them on edge. I slowed down, swinging the flashlight toward their direction. I could barely make out the shape of their house, an old white building that looked even paler under the flashlight's weak beam. I don't know what made me look a bit closer. Maybe it was the sound of something heavy stepping on broken branches, maybe just the feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned my flashlight slowly, and that's when I saw it. Behind that white house, something stood towering above the corner of the structure. It was huge, much taller than any man I'd ever seen, and covered in thick, dark hair. It was just a silhouette at first, no real details, but I could sense it was massive, bulky, maybe as wide as 2 grown men standing side by side. I remember my heart pounding so loud in my ears that I thought I might pass out. And then it turned its head toward me. I'll never forget those eyes. They had a strange shine to them, not like a reflection from my flashlight, but like they had their own dull glow. They stared right at me, and in that moment I felt something primal, an instinctual fear that I'd never felt before. It's not easy to describe, but it felt like every cell in my body was screaming at me to run, to get away from that thing as fast as I could. I tried to yell, but my voice just caught in my throat. Before I could even move, the thing lunged forward, not all the way into the open, but just enough to show me how fast it could be. It didn't make any real noise, just a heavy thud as it hit the ground at the edge of that property. It moved toward the road, like it was testing me, seeing how I would react. For a split second, I froze. I was too scared to move, like my legs had turned to cement. All I could think was that this wasn't human, and that it could tear me apart if it wanted to. Then, almost as quickly as it appeared, it stopped. It stood there at the edge of the road, looming over me. I couldn't see its face clearly, just the shape of a head and those eyes. But I knew it was looking straight at me. The neighbors' dogs were going crazy, barking and whining like I'd never heard before. It felt like time stretched on forever. I finally managed to turn around, and I ran. I ran like I've never run in my life. I didn't care about being quiet. I didn't care about stumbling over branches or potholes. I just knew I had to get away. I could feel the cold sweat running down my back, my breathing shallow and panicked. I never looked back. I was sure if I did, I'd see it closing the distance, ready to reach out and grab me. My flashlight bounced wildly, lighting up tree trunks and twisted bushes, and every shape looked like a monster waiting to jump out. When I reached home, I rushed inside, slammed the door, and locked it. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost, because my dad asked what the hell was wrong with me. I couldn't explain it. How do you tell someone you just saw something that shouldn't exist? I just remember standing there, shaking, holding my flashlight, trying to get words out and failing. My dad looked at me like I was making it up, maybe just spooked by the darkness. I don't blame him. Even today, if someone told me a story like that, I'd probably be skeptical. I never went back out that night. The ice from my grandparents' store never made it to our house. For years, I tried to convince myself it was some trick of the light, maybe a bear, though we didn't have bears around there, or some big stray animal that looked bigger in the shadows. But nothing fits that memory. It wasn't just its size. It was the way it moved, the intent in its eyes. It was like it was studying me, letting me know it could reach me if it wanted. After that night, I could never walk down that road without thinking about it, especially after dark. The event ended as quickly as it started. One moment the thing was there, the next I was inside my house, safe but shaken. I never saw it again, and I never heard any stories about something like that roaming our area. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. It's been decades, and that image is still carved into my memory. I don't know what it was. Some people might call it a Bigfoot or a skunk ape. Others might say it was just my imagination, or maybe stress from the hurricane and the darkness. All I know is that I saw something that night, something large, hairy, and terrifying, standing behind that old white house, watching me in the dim beam of my flashlight. It charged toward me, stopped at the road, and then vanished as I ran for my life. It's stuck with me ever since, a reminder that there are things out there we can't easily explain. I still get chills thinking about it. It was there, I know it was. And I've never been able to shake that feeling of being watched in the dark ever again. Story 16. I remember it was January 2003, right after midnight, and I was driving along Highway 62, heading back home from a late-night fishing trip. I'd been out near Gville, Arkansas. The air was freezing, the kind of cold that makes your fingers stiff even inside the car, and the sky was completely clear. The road was empty. I think I passed maybe one car in the last 20 minutes. You know that feeling when it's so quiet you can hear your own breathing over the hum of the engine. Anyway, I came around this curve, and my headlights swept over the shoulder of the road. I thought I saw something odd, like a big shape moving. At first I figured it might be a deer stepping out, or maybe a bear. I tapped the brakes, just to slow down a little and see what it was. Normally I wouldn't think twice, but something about how it moved caught my eye. It wasn't just crouching or scurrying off, it was standing, upright. As I got closer, the headlights lit it up more clearly. I swear on everything I know, it looked like a tall, dark, shaggy figure on two legs. The hair was long and kind of messy, like tangled fur all over its body. My first thought was that maybe it was a man in some kind of weird coat, but it was too bulky, and the proportions seemed off. The shoulders were massive, and the arms hung longer than they should. My heart started pounding instantly because it was just so damn weird. It began to move, stepping onto the edge of the asphalt. The movement was smooth and confident, not wobbly like a drunk guy or someone wearing a costume. It was like it had full control of its body. I could see its legs bending, and it took these long, deliberate strides. I swear it looked strong enough to tear the door off my truck if it wanted to. For a second, I thought about just hitting the gas and zooming past. But I was stunned, almost frozen, watching this thing. It kind of stopped, and I got the impression it was looking directly at me. I didn't see the details of its face. My lights only showed the shape of its head and the outline of what had to be its eyes. They caught the light for a moment, like a faint reflection, but I couldn't make out color or any features. Still, I could feel it looking at me, studying me, as if trying to figure out what I was doing there. This might sound crazy, but it felt like there was a tension in the air, like I'd intruded on something I wasn't supposed to see. My pulse was racing, and I could feel this weird heaviness in my chest. At that moment, I realized I was gripping the steering wheel so tight that my knuckles hurt. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. It was one of those moments that stretch out, where seconds feel like minutes. Then, before I could even fully process what was happening, it did something I still can't wrap my head around. It leaned forward, placing what looked like its knuckles or hands on the pavement, like how an ape might do. But it wasn't clumsy. It launched itself across the two-lane highway in a blink. I'm talking a swift, controlled motion. It cleared the center line and got to the other side of the road so fast it's hard to describe. I've never seen a person or an animal move like that. It was almost graceful, but in a really unsettling way. After it crossed, it just vanished into the darkness of the brush and trees beyond the shoulder. I couldn't see anything past my headlights, and it left no sound behind. I rolled down my window just a crack, trying to catch any noise, maybe a branch snapping or leaves rustling. But there was nothing, just silence and the cool night air hitting my face. I sat there for a few seconds, engine idling, my heart thumping like I'd run a marathon. I remember my hands shaking, and I felt this odd numbness in my arms. Part of me wanted to jump out of the car and check the roadside to see if I could find footprints or something, but there was no way in hell I was getting out. I wasn't even sure what I had just seen, and fear was still crawling through my veins. Eventually, I just slowly hit the gas and kept going. I drove home in silence, too stunned to turn on the radio or do anything that might distract me. I kept checking my rearview mirror, expecting to see it running behind me or standing somewhere along the road. But there was nothing, just darkness and the quiet road. When I got home, I felt numb. I locked the door behind me and went straight to wash my face with cold water, hoping that would help me think straight. I didn't know who to tell or how to explain what I saw. I didn't have any proof, no photos, no tracks, no fur. Just that image burned into my mind of something big, upright, and impossibly fast. Something that looked me in the eye. I've spent years thinking about that night. I've tried to convince myself it was a bear standing funny or some large guy wearing a heavy winter coat. But deep down, I know those explanations don't fit. The way it moved, the shape of its body, the way it reacted to my presence, none of it lines up with any animal or person I know. It's been over a decade, and I still can't fully explain what I witnessed that night. I haven't seen anything like it since, and I've never heard of anyone else seeing something similar in that exact spot. But the memory still rattles me. I try not to think about it too often, because it brings back that same tight feeling in my chest, that same uneasy feeling that I saw something I shouldn't have. There's no neat conclusion to this. It happened, and then it ended. I never got answers. To this day, I'm just left with questions and that haunting image of a towering, fur-covered shape staring at me in the glow of my headlights before vanishing into the cold, dark Arkansas night. Story 17. I was about 13 back then, around 1987, standing knee-deep in the White River near Calico Rock, Arkansas. My mom and aunt were just a few steps downstream, trying their luck at catching trout. I remember the sun felt hot on my neck, and the river's cool water offered a strange mix of comfort and unease. It was pretty quiet except for the gentle rush of water and the soft splash of my mom adjusting her line. There wasn't much around besides a rocky cliff on the opposite side, some scattered shrubs, and a thin line of trees behind us. After a while, I got bored watching them fish in the same spot. I told them I was going to move upstream a bit, maybe 100 meters or so, to see if there were any shallower areas or just something more interesting. Neither of them really minded. My aunt just glanced over her shoulder and sort of waved me off. I felt this weird mix of independence and nervousness walking away, but I was a kid who liked exploring, so I pushed forward. As I moved along the bank, the river's bend offered a bit of seclusion. The water there was quieter, the kind of spot where you could hear every small sound. I heard small pebbles shifting under my sneakers and twigs snapping under my feet. The trees behind me were taller and the undergrowth thicker, so I felt like I was alone in a place that didn't get many visitors. The rock cliff was still visible across the river, but I had to look back to see it since I was now focused on the stretch ahead. I remember the moment I noticed something felt off. I was standing knee-deep near a patch of smaller rocks when I heard a snap from behind. Not just a twig. It sounded like a thicker branch, something that would take strength to break. I froze, my heart pounding instantly. The kind of fear you don't really understand at that age, but can't ignore either. At first, I hoped maybe it was a deer or a black bear. Even a black bear would have been scary, but at least I knew they existed out there. But the sound that came next didn't match what I'd expect from a deer or anything else I knew. It was this heavy breathing, kind of wet and rough, and then a low grunt. It wasn't loud, but it was close enough to make the hair on my arms stand straight up. I turned and looked into the tree line, trying to spot whatever was there. The trees here were tall and skinny, and you could see where the canopy started. I saw movement up there, high up, like something large brushing past the thinner trunks. The tops of those trees swayed, not violently, but enough to catch my eye. It was like a big shape was moving slowly, circling, staying just out of clear view. I couldn't make out a head or a body, just this motion that felt too deliberate, too careful. The whole time, I kept hearing these soft steps, heavy and crunching dry leaves, like it knew I was there and didn't care if I heard it. Whatever it was seemed big, bigger than a person, bigger than any animal I'd seen around those parts. I tried to call out for my mom, but my voice came out in a shaky whisper. I forced myself to walk backward, never taking my eyes off the place where I saw the treetops shake. Then I saw something I still can't get out of my mind, a shape between two trunks, just for a split second. Dark, tall, hunched maybe. I couldn't see a face or details. It was like the shape of something covered in dark hair, blending into the shadowed woods. It moved so smoothly that it didn't seem natural. And the smell, I don't know how to explain it. It wasn't like a skunk or a decaying animal. It was this earthy, damp smell, like wet fur and old leaves. It just made me feel sick to my stomach, like my body knew I needed to get out of there. My heart was hammering, and I kept stepping back until I was closer to the spot where my mom and aunt were fishing. The moment I reached a patch of sunlight that cut through the trees and hit the riverbank, I felt a tiny bit safer. I turned around and walked fast down the bank to where they were. They were still focused on their fishing lines. I remember my aunt complaining about a snag in her reel, and my mom seemed totally unaware that I'd been freaking out just upstream. I told them, breathless, eyes probably wide, that something weird was up there. I tried to say it was something big in the woods, that I heard it and smelled it, that I saw it moving through the treetops. They both looked at me like I was overreacting, maybe expecting a bear or a deer story, but I kept insisting it wasn't normal. I remember my mom looking concerned but not alarmed. My aunt seemed annoyed, like I was trying to scare them for fun. Still, I was so worked up that my mom finally said we should maybe head back to the main area where the car was parked, just to be safe. As we gathered our gear, I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the tree line. I didn't hear the heavy breathing anymore, but I felt like we were being watched. Every now and then, I'd catch a slight rustle of leaves where there was no breeze, or a glimpse of branches shifting in a spot where I knew the wind hadn't reached. At one point, as we were leaving, I could have sworn I saw the shape again, just a hint of it, farther into the woods, standing still. No details, no features, just a dark outline that blended into the surroundings. And then it just disappeared behind a cluster of shrubs. We walked back along the river's edge to where the trail led to the car. The sound of the water and the crunch of gravel under our feet felt louder now. My aunt kept telling me I needed to calm down, that I was worked up over nothing, but my mom's silence was telling. She wasn't saying much, and that's what unsettled me. I think she sensed that I was genuinely scared, even if she couldn't explain it. I never saw a face or a clear shape. I never found footprints or fur or any physical proof. But the tension in the air was real. I knew something was there, watching us, following us. The river that I usually found peaceful now felt menacing, as if the trees themselves were hiding something I was never meant to see. When we finally got back to the car, I remember the way my hands shook as I tried to tie my shoelaces. I didn't want to look back at the forest. That night, I barely slept. For years, I tried to convince myself it was just a bear or some trick of the light, but it never quite fit the way it moved, the sounds it made, that awful smell, or the way those tree crowns shifted as if something huge was brushing past them at a level no normal animal would move. And nothing else has ever made me feel that kind of fear again. I wish I had a proper explanation. Footprints, a nest, some hair sample, but I don't. All I have is the memory of that strange, hulking presence out in the woods that day, and the feeling that it knew I was there. Even now, decades later, I can't shake the sense that I caught a glimpse of something that wasn't supposed to be seen. My mom and aunt never talked about it afterward. It was like they forgot or didn't want to believe me. But I know what I felt. I know something was out there, just beyond the riverbank. And to this day, it's something I can't explain. Story 18. I remember it was around late afternoon, sometime in the fall of 1985. I was living in Coal Hill, Arkansas, and I had this habit of wandering through the woods behind my place. I wasn't hunting or anything, just exploring. The area around my home had this thick strip of forest that led down into a sort of ravine, pretty steep, filled with loose rock and layers of fallen leaves. I liked going there because it was quiet, and sometimes I'd find old animal tracks or stumble on interesting plants. It was always peaceful in a way, at least until that day. That day, the woods felt different. The sun was still out, but the light was fading and turning that golden color that hits right before dusk. I remember hearing the crunch of leaves under my boots with every step. The air was cool and still. Usually, I'd hear birds, or maybe see a squirrel dart across fallen logs. But that afternoon, there was this strange hush. Not total silence, but more like the kind of quiet that makes you feel like something's off. I didn't pay it too much mind at first. Maybe I just wasn't paying attention. I made my way toward the ravine. There's this spot where you can look down and see all the trees dropping off sharply. I stopped there and scanned the area, like I always did, looking for deer or maybe a bobcat if I got lucky. I was leaning forward, peering down, and that's when I heard it. It sounded like heavy steps, but they weren't normal. They were heavy in a way that made the ground seem to almost tremble. Not like thunder, but more like something seriously big shifting its weight on crunchy leaves and snapping twigs. The sound came from the opposite side of the ravine. It was thickly wooded, and the late-day light didn't reach well into those shadows. I stepped a bit closer to the edge, trying not to rustle the leaves too much, because I didn't want to scare off whatever animal it might be. At first, I thought maybe it was a bear. It would have been unusual, but not impossible. But these were more like footsteps, distinct steps, two at a time, like a person's stride, but heavier, more deliberate. I crouched down, hoping to blend in with the brush. My heart was pounding in my ears. I didn't feel panic right away, just adrenaline and excitement. I kept watching that dark green wall of foliage across the gap. That's when I saw something move. I can't say it was slow or fast, just this fluid, heavy motion. The creature stepped into a patch of light that was cutting through the trees on that slope. It was tall, much taller than any human. If I had to guess, maybe 7, 8 feet, maybe more. Its body looked broad and covered in dark, shaggy hair, not like a bear's fur, but longer, hanging in uneven patches. It was walking on 2 legs, and even though the terrain was uneven and full of loose rocks and dead branches, it moved as if it had no trouble at all keeping balance. I tried to see its face, but it was angled away from me, and the shadows kept it mostly hidden. I could see a hint of something that looked more human-like than animal, but I can't be certain. The silhouette was the clearest thing, 2 massive legs, long arms that swung slightly, and a head that sat square on its shoulders. This thing wasn't hunched over like an ape on all fours. It was upright, moving with this weird, controlled confidence. At that moment, I remember feeling this chill crawl over me. My mouth went dry, and I felt this pressure in my chest. It wasn't just fear. It was this sudden realization that I was seeing something I shouldn't be seeing, something that felt completely out of place, like it didn't belong in the normal world I knew. The woods were still dead quiet except for the sound of these steps, this heavy crunch as it made its way across the slope. I decided I had to get closer to confirm what I was looking at. I'm not sure why. It was a dumb idea. Curiosity, or maybe just disbelief, pushed me forward. I took a careful step closer, trying to shift my weight so that I wouldn't slip or make any noise. As I did, I must have kicked a small branch or something because it made a snapping sound. Just a tiny noise, but enough to grab its attention. It paused mid-step. My heart jumped so hard I could hear the pulse in my head. I froze, barely breathing. Across the ravine, I saw it slightly tilt its upper body. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I felt it looking right in my direction. The quiet became suffocating. I didn't know what to do. My instincts screamed at me to run, but something kept me rooted there. Seconds passed, maybe more. I couldn't tell. Every muscle in my body felt tight. And then, without any warning, it just moved again. But this time, it stepped out of sight. It didn't run. It just melted back into the shadows, silent and smooth, like it knew exactly where to step to avoid making noise. One moment it was there, and the next, it was gone. No leaves rustling, no branches breaking, nothing. The silence that followed was even worse than before. I scanned the area, leaning forward, trying to catch a glimpse of it through the thick undergrowth. but it was just gone. The feeling that hit me then was pure dread. Not the kind where you scream, but the kind that makes you feel totally alone and vulnerable. I didn't waste any time. My legs suddenly worked again, and I got the hell out of there. I scrambled back through the trees, practically tripping over myself, not caring how much noise I made now. The only thought in my head was to get back home, get inside, and lock the door. I ran until my lungs burned, and when I reached my backyard, I realized how fast and far I'd sprinted. I remember bending over, hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath and calm down. For a moment, I considered going back to verify what I saw, maybe look for footprints the next day, but the thought of returning to that spot made my skin crawl. I never told many people about that encounter. Honestly, who would believe me? Folks would say I saw a bear standing weird, or that my eyes played tricks in the fading light. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear, and it wasn't a person. It was something else. I can still picture that huge, broad figure, the way it moved, the way the forest just seemed to absorb it afterward, like it belonged there in a way I never could. To this day, I don't have a neat explanation. It never happened again as far as I know. The woods went back to being just woods. But whenever I think about it, I get that same uneasy feeling in my gut. I guess some things out there are just beyond what we're ready to understand. I've spent years trying not to think too much about it, but that memory just clings to me, especially late at night or when I catch a certain angle of light in the trees. It never really leaves. Story 19. I still remember that morning like it happened yesterday. It was mid-October 1981, and I was 17, driving my old Volkswagen down Highway 68 near Syum Springs, Arkansas. I used to leave for work before sunrise because my boss wanted me there before anyone else, and I was trying to make a good impression. It was still dark, the road was empty, and I was tired, but I knew every turn and bump on that highway. It wasn't my first time making that early run, but what happened that day was something I've never been able to forget. I was approaching this old bridge, just a simple, narrow structure that I'd crossed countless times. I remember how the dim glow of my headlights looked on the worn wooden planks. Visibility wasn't great. I was going maybe 30-35 miles per hour because I knew deer sometimes wandered across. But on that morning, what I saw wasn't a deer or any animal I can explain. At first, I caught a glimpse of a shape hunched over right in the middle of the bridge. My headlights weren't strong, just standard old halogens, but enough to pick out something blocking the path. My first thought was a big dog, or maybe a lost coyote. It was just squatting there, barely moving, but as I got closer, I realized this thing was too big and oddly shaped for a dog. Its silhouette looked off, like its limbs were too long. I slowed down instinctively, not wanting to hit it. That's when I noticed it had these reddish-brown hairs all over its body. But it wasn't just fur like a bear. Its arms seemed too human-like, long and bent at weird angles. I remember this wave of confusion coming over me. I even leaned forward, squinting, like maybe I was seeing things. It was so early and still dark. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks, but it wasn't a trick. As my car got closer, maybe just a couple car lengths away, it suddenly stood up. I mean, it rose onto two legs so smoothly it made my stomach flip. It wasn't stumbling or struggling. It went from crouched to upright, like it was totally comfortable standing that way. I could see its head turned toward me. The headlights caught its face for just a second, and I swear it had less hair there, like patches of lighter skin around the eyes, making them stand out. I can't forget that face. It wasn't fully human, but it wasn't fully animal either. It was something in between, and that's what scared me most. It stared right at me, just for a heartbeat, as if it was surprised to see a car at that hour. I felt a chill run down my back. I didn't stop. I kept rolling forward slowly, almost in disbelief. My heart was pounding. Then, without warning, it took off. It moved so fast, crossing the rest of the bridge in these huge strides, 2 or 3 steps maybe, and then it was gone, disappearing into the dense brush on the side of the road. I remember the exact moment it vanished from the beam of my headlights. 1 second it was there, the next it was just darkness and leaves shaking. I drove over the spot where it had stood, half expecting I'd see something, footprints maybe, or hear something rustling in the bushes. But I heard nothing over my engine's low hum. I glanced in my rear-view mirror right after passing, half hoping to confirm what I'd seen. Nothing. Just an empty, dark road stretching behind me. For the rest of that drive, I felt like my body was buzzing with adrenaline. I kept checking the shoulders of the road, scanning for any movement. I tried to reason it out. Maybe it was just some huge guy wearing fur or a crazy-looking costume. But why would anyone be out there alone on a cold October morning before dawn, squatting in the middle of that bridge? It made no sense. By the time I got to work, I was still shaken. I remember parking behind the building and just sitting there in the car for a minute, trying to calm myself down. When I walked inside, I tried to act normal, but I must have looked pale or on edge. A co-worker asked if I was okay. I just mumbled something about not feeling too great. I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone what I'd seen. I was afraid they'd think I was losing it, or that I was trying to make some weird joke. All day I couldn't get it out of my mind. I tried to concentrate on my tasks, tried to focus on my boss's instructions, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that strange creature's face staring back at me. I wondered if it had followed me somehow, if it was lurking around outside. At one point, I even walked to the window to check the parking lot, feeling stupid but unable to shake the paranoia. During my lunch break, I just sat alone, going over every detail. The color of the fur, the way it moved, the weird feeling it gave me. Nothing matched anything I knew. I'd heard of people talking about strange creatures in the woods, but I never gave it much thought. We have bears, deer, even big cats out here sometimes. But this was different. It looked too much like something that could think. There was an intelligence in that brief moment of eye contact that made my skin crawl. After work, I had to drive back the same way. I was so on edge that I left a bit earlier than usual, hoping I'd hit that stretch of road before it got too dark. The whole drive home, I kept expecting to see it again, or at least some sign that I hadn't imagined it. But I saw nothing unusual, just the regular emptiness of rural Arkansas roads. When I finally got home, I was quiet. My family noticed something was off, but I didn't say anything. I made up some excuse about being tired. It was years before I told anyone what I saw that morning. Even now, I don't like talking about it much. There's this feeling you get when you've seen something that doesn't fit into your world. It's unsettling, like you've peeked behind a curtain at something you were never meant to witness. I never saw it again, not once in all the drives I made along that highway before sunrise. The memory still makes me uneasy. I've heard stories since, people claiming to see strange ape-like figures in the woods, what some call Bigfoot. But back then, I had no frame of reference. Whatever it wasn't just a bear or a man in a suit. It moved with this fluid grace and vanished too quickly. It happened so fast, yet it's burned into my memory. I'm older now, and I've told this story a handful of times, but no one's ever given me an explanation that feels right. There's no neat ending, no follow-up sightings I can point to, no proof. Just that one eerie morning on a quiet Arkansas road before the sun came up, when I saw something that shouldn't exist and then never saw it again. I'm left with the same questions today as I had then, and I guess I always will be. Story 20. I remember it like it was yesterday, even though it's been decades now. It was back in 1990, late summer, early evening, not too far from Skylaak Lake Road, near Nenana, Alaska. I was headed home after visiting a cousin who lived a couple of miles upriver. I had my old pickup truck then, and the road was just a narrow stretch of packed dirt, weaving through thick patches of spruce and birch. The weather was calm and quiet. There was this faint orange glow in the sky, the kind you get when the sun's just slipped behind the horizon, but it's not fully dark yet. I remember slowing down a bit because the road was uneven and full of loose gravel. I knew these parts well, had driven this route so many times before that I could almost do it with my eyes closed. Around that time, I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. Bears sometimes wandered by, and I'd seen moose crossing at night, but it was usually just empty woods and the hum of my engine echoing off the trees. As I rounded a slight bend, something caught my eye. It was moving along the tree line, maybe 100 meters ahead. At first I assumed it might be a bear, dark fur, large, moving on two legs. But something was off. Bears don't just stroll upright across a road like that, not in such a smooth, almost casual way. And this thing was taller, leaner, clearly more agile. I eased off the gas, not slamming the brakes, just letting the truck coast. I leaned forward, squinting through my windshield, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was tall, easily around 2 meters, maybe even a bit more. Thick, dark hair covered it from head to toe. It wasn't lumbering like a bear would. Its movements were more purposeful, almost fluid, as if it had no trouble balancing on 2 legs. The shoulders were broad, muscular. From the brief glimpse I got, its limbs were proportioned more like a very tall, well-built man than an animal. The head seemed somewhat conical, but I can't be completely sure because it never turned fully toward me. Still, it paused when it noticed me. It didn't run immediately. Instead, it almost seemed curious, like it was surprised to see me there. For a second, I felt like we were both trying to figure each other out. Me behind the wheel of my truck, it standing under the dim light, half in the open, half in the shadow of the trees. I was so stunned I forgot to breathe for a moment. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I didn't feel like it was going to attack. It didn't roar, didn't charge, didn't show its teeth. But the sheer strangeness, this thing that looked nothing like the wildlife I knew, made every hair on my body stand on end. I felt a chill, the kind of chill that doesn't come from the weather, but from something unsettling that your mind can't process. Then it took off, as if I'd broken some spell just by staring too long. It moved so quickly back into the forest that I barely caught its last step. It vanished almost silently, leaving just the faint rustle of branches. One moment it was there, and then it was gone, like it had melted into the vegetation. I sat there for a minute or two, engine idling, headlights pointing at an empty stretch of road. I was trying to wrap my head around what I'd seen. This wasn't a bear. I know what bears look like. I've lived here all my life, seen them standing up, running, wandering around cabins. This thing's posture and movement were completely different. It also didn't move like a man in a suit. It didn't have that awkward, stiff gait. It was seamless and quick, with a kind of natural grace I wouldn't expect from something so large. It just felt real. My mind was racing with questions. What the hell did I just see? Some people out here talk about strange creatures, legends passed down over generations. I grew up hearing stories, but I always took them as old tales meant to keep kids from wandering too far into the woods. And yet, here I was, face to face, almost, with something I couldn't explain. I thought about reporting it, but who would I tell? The local authorities would probably laugh or roll their eyes. I'm a religious man, always tried to be honest, never one to make up weird stories. But that's exactly what this would sound like, a weird, made-up story. I ended up only telling a few family members and close friends. Some believed me, or at least didn't doubt my word. Others tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear with mange, or some hunter wearing a strange coat, or my eyes playing tricks in the twilight. But I know what I saw. I know how it felt. None of the usual explanations fit. I remember finishing the drive home in silence. Every shadow in the trees seemed to move. Every creak my truck made set me on edge. By the time I got home, I didn't want to step outside. That night, I barely slept. My mind kept replaying the scene. The creature stepping out, its pause when it noticed me, how quickly it vanished. I kept thinking, could it come near my home? Would I see it again if I drove that way tomorrow? Part of me wanted to go back in daylight and look for footprints, some sign in the dirt, but I never did. Something about that encounter made me not want to dig deeper. Maybe I was afraid of what I'd find, or not find. The uncertainty was bad enough, but confirming it could be worse. In all these years, I haven't found a neat explanation. The memory hasn't faded like old stories do. Instead, it stayed pretty vivid, like a photograph tucked away in my mind. I still drive that road sometimes, and every time I pass that spot, I slow down, glance into the trees, wondering if I'll catch a hint of something impossible again. But I never have. It's like it just appeared and disappeared in one day, leaving me with this memory that I can't fully shake. I'm not here to convince anyone. I'm just sharing what I experienced. It was the kind of moment that leaves you a little shaken, a bit uncertain about what you think you know. To this day, I don't have answers. All I know is what I saw. That strange figure crossing the dirt road, staring at me for that brief moment, and then melting back into the wild. It felt like I'd glimpsed something I wasn't meant to see, something that belongs out there in the deep woods, hidden from view. And it still makes me shiver when I think about it. Story 21. Back in the summer of 1995, not long after my dad first told me about what he'd seen years before, I decided to head out to the area near Lost Bridge Village in Arkansas. I was fixated on the story he shared, a strange figure he swore he'd spotted near Beaver Lake while riding ATVs with friends. He said it was huge, hairy, walking upright just inside the tree line, moving between the golden streaks of sunlight late in the day. He never got anyone to believe him back then, and even when he finally told me, I could sense how frustrated he still felt. The way he described it stuck with me. He looked dead serious. No joking around. Something about it just felt too raw to be a lie. So I took a drive out there myself, one afternoon, when the weather was hot and the woods were alive with that buzzing quiet, where everything seems normal but also strangely alert. I'd never really been deep into that particular patch of forest before. It wasn't far off some old dirt roads that split off from the main route. I remember that day clearly. The air tasted dusty, the pine needles crunched softly under my boots, and there was this mild, almost sweet smell coming from the undergrowth. It was late afternoon, and the sun was starting to sink low, cutting angled beams through the leaves. I wanted to be there at about the same time my dad had his sighting, hoping maybe I'd understand what he saw, or at least see what kind of weird shadows might trick someone's eyes. I parked my truck just off a narrow gravel road and hiked in on foot. The deeper I went, the quieter it got, except for the occasional rustle of small animals. I was on alert, partly excited, partly embarrassed at myself for even doing this. But I had to know if my dad was onto something, or if he'd just been mistaken all those years ago. I crested a small ridge, and right before me was a slope leading down to a broad dirt trail, probably an old logging road. The light was perfect, bright but slanting, hitting the tops of the brush and casting long shadows on the ground below. I remember standing there, breathing slow, trying to imagine where he must have been and where this thing had walked. I moved quietly, trying not to snap every twig. The forest felt normal but tense, like I wasn't supposed to be there. That's when I caught it. A sudden movement at the edge of my vision. Not big, just a subtle shift in the pattern of leaves and branches. I froze. It was maybe 50 yards away, half hidden behind a mix of pines and thick brush. Before I could rationalize it, I saw what looked like a tall, dark shape move between two large trees. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't a bear either. The shoulders were too broad, the body too upright. I remember thinking, oh my God, Dad wasn't lying. I crouched down, heart pounding in my ears. My mouth went dry. I couldn't see its face, just a tall figure covered in what looked like dark, matted hair, moving slowly and deliberately at the edge of the tree line. The way it stepped, it wasn't stumbling or on all fours. It had this weird, deliberate stride, like it knew exactly where to place its feet. I could swear it was well over 6 feet tall, but the distance and the shock made it hard to judge. Still, it was bigger than any person I knew, and the proportions just seemed off, like its arms were a bit longer, its torso bulkier than a normal man's. I tried to inch closer. Every step I took felt painfully loud. I gripped a nearby sapling, trying to stay steady. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and quick. Then it stepped into a patch of direct sunlight for just a second, and I saw the silhouette clearly. My stomach dropped. There was no mistaking the shape of a head, shoulders, arms, legs, like a person, but not a person. The hair covering its body seemed thick and uneven. It paused, tilting its head slightly as if listening. That was the moment I realized it probably knew I was there. A chill ran up my spine. I felt completely exposed, like a trespasser. I didn't want to run, but I also didn't want to stand there like a fool waiting to see what it would do next. My mind raced. Should I call out? Should I pretend I'm not there? Should I try to get a better look? It stepped behind a large tree trunk, and I lost sight of it for a split second. When I shifted my position to see around the tree, it was gone, just gone. No loud crashing through the underbrush, no heavy footsteps, nothing. The forest was deadly still again, except now every tiny sound made me flinch. A squirrel darted up a tree behind me, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I tried to stay calm. My eyes darted everywhere, scanning for any sign of movement. I saw nothing, but I felt this sense of being watched, like it was still there, just out of view. I waited, maybe a minute or two, though it felt like a lifetime. Slowly, I started backing away, careful not to turn my back on the spot I'd last seen it. The tension in my shoulders was unbelievable. My whole body was shaking, not in a dramatic way, but this controlled, nervous tremor that I just couldn't stop. I made my way back up the ridge, and then turned to speed walk towards my truck. It felt like the trees were closing in on me. Every branch and leaf seemed sharper and darker. I remember thinking, this is exactly what my dad described. The way he insisted he saw something taller and stranger than any regular animal. I always thought he might have misjudged a shadow or seen a bear standing upright for a moment. But this was exactly as he said, but even more unsettling because now I'd seen it too. By the time I reached my truck, my shirt was soaked with sweat. I fumbled for my keys, hands shaking, heart still hammering. I locked myself inside and just sat there, engine off, windows rolled up, gripping the steering wheel. I felt like I should go back, maybe try to find footprints or something that would prove I wasn't losing my mind. But the memory of that thing's silhouette, tall, hairy, too human and yet not human, kept me glued to the driver's seat. I just wanted to get out of there. Eventually, I started the engine and headed back. The sun was lower now, painting the sky orange and pink, and the forest's edge looked almost peaceful from the safety of the road. But I knew better. Something was in there. I couldn't explain it any better than my dad could. I wasn't expecting to see anything that day. I went out there because I was curious, and I got more than I bargained for. To this day, I can't say what it was. I've run through every logical explanation. Maybe a hunter in a ghillie suit, maybe a trick of the light, maybe a bizarre-looking bear. None of that fits. My gut tells me I saw what my dad saw, something that just isn't supposed to exist, but somehow does. And that's where it ends. It didn't charge at me. It didn't roar. It didn't do anything out of a movie scene. It just walked, paused, and disappeared. That's the part that gets me. It was there, and then it wasn't, leaving me with nothing but a lingering fear and this gnawing sense of mystery I can't shake off. I never told many people about it, because I know exactly how they'd react. They'd laugh, roll their eyes, or think I'm trying to get attention. But I know what I saw. My dad knew what he saw, and neither of us can explain it. Sometimes I wish I had never gone out there. Now I have this memory stuck in my head, and it'll probably stay with me forever. Story 22. Back in late summer 2006, my partner and I decided to take a drive outside Deer, Arkansas, to find a good spot for stargazing. I remember it was a clear night, almost unnaturally bright under the moonlight. There were hardly any clouds, and the temperature had dropped just enough to make the air feel crisp. We'd parked on a dirt pull-off near a dense patch of forest and started walking down a narrow trail that I'm pretty sure only locals knew about. We weren't planning a long hike, just a short walk to find an opening in the trees where we could sit, lean back, and watch the sky. That was our only intention, just relax and take in the stars. We'd gone maybe half a mile in, and the silence was what really struck me first. Out there, you expect to hear some crickets or distant hoots of an owl, at least the subtle rustle of leaves, but it was like the entire forest was holding its breath. We had our small flashlight, but we kept it off most of the time, letting our eyes adjust to the moonlight. The moon was bright enough that we could see the silhouettes of trees, the outline of bushes, and the faint hint of the trail under our boots. For a while it was nice, kind of peaceful, but something started to feel off. Not immediately threatening, just strange. I can't explain it exactly, but it's like when the hair on the back of your neck stands up for no good reason. I tried to push that feeling away, kept telling myself I was just being paranoid. But as we walked a bit further, the discomfort only grew stronger. I glanced at my partner, and I could tell from their tight expression that they felt it too. It's almost like we weren't alone. You know when you sense someone's eyes on you? That's exactly what it felt like, except we were in the middle of nowhere, and nobody else knew we were there. I finally decided to click on the flashlight and sweep the beam along the forest floor, hoping maybe I'd catch sight of a deer or some small animal that would explain the creeping sensation. The beam cut through the darkness, and immediately I noticed that the underbrush looked disturbed, like something large had moved through recently. I couldn't see footprints, not clearly anyway, but the leaves and branches seemed pushed aside in a way that felt unnatural. That's when we heard it. Heavy steps. Not just a single crack of a branch, but a slow, deliberate trudging sound, like something big was shifting its weight just out of sight. We stopped moving completely, standing dead still, and tried to pinpoint the direction. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I think I whispered my partner's name at some point, but I was too rattled to remember what I actually said. Then came the noise I will never forget, a scream or maybe more of a howl that lasted several long seconds. It began at a lower tone, then climbed into a sharp, high-pitched wail that forced me to clamp my jaw shut, just to stop from gasping too loudly. I've never heard anything like it in my life. It wasn't a coyote or a fox, and it sure as hell didn't sound like any person I've ever met. The pitch and intensity made my chest vibrate. It got deep inside my head. It was like a mix of a distant siren and a furious roar, something completely out of place in that quiet patch of forest. My partner grabbed my arm, and we both raised the flashlight, shining it into the direction where we thought the sound came from. I couldn't see anything but trees and layered shadows. Yet, I felt something there, just beyond the reach of the light. Something tall, solid, and watching us. The feeling of being watched was so intense, it made me feel nauseous. I tried to steady the flashlight, but my hand was shaking, causing the beam to jitter on the tree trunks. We didn't run. Something about that presence told me running would be a terrible idea. Instead, we took a few steps backward, very slowly, not turning our backs. I remember the exact crunch of leaves under my boots, how every tiny noise I made sounded dangerously loud. I remember trying not to breathe too hard, afraid any sudden sound would provoke whatever it was. It moved again, and I heard branches snap with a strength that no small animal could produce. Something about the way it seemed to pace behind the foliage made my stomach turn. It was like it was letting us know it was there, sizing us up. I could smell this earthy odor, kind of musty, like damp fur or wet soil. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it hit me. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was distinct enough to stand out in the otherwise clean night air. We kept backing away, step by step, until we were sure we weren't about to slam into a tree. We tried to keep the flashlight directed straight ahead, but there was no defining shape, just that overwhelming sense of being watched. I think at one point I whispered something like, "Let's just get back to the car," and my partner nodded. We didn't talk, not really, just exchanged terrified glances. As we slowly retreated, the heavy steps seemed to follow, staying just out of sight. I thought maybe I caught a glimpse of movement, a large dark mass shifting between the tree trunks, but I can't be certain. It might have just been my eyes playing tricks on me. The scream or howl didn't repeat. Instead, I heard a strange huffing sound, like heavy breathing. I'll never forget how that breathing made my skin crawl. We kept inching backward until the trees thinned out, and the car was finally within sight. I can't tell you how much relief I felt seeing that old car sitting in the moonlight, like a lifeline waiting for us. Still, I couldn't bring myself to turn around completely. I kept the flashlight aimed into the darkness behind us, even as we fumbled with the keys and slid inside. Once we shut the doors, we just stared out the windshield for a few seconds, trying to catch our breath. We didn't hang around to think it through. My partner started the engine, and I kept looking back through the rear window, hoping I wouldn't see something stepping out of the trees. Nothing emerged. The forest looked calm and empty, which almost made it worse. We drove out of there faster than I'd care to admit. Neither of us said a word until we were halfway back to the main road. To this day, I don't know what we encountered. We've talked about it a few times, tried to rationalize it. Maybe a bear or some other large animal. But that scream, that weird feeling, it doesn't match anything I've ever known in these woods. I've heard people talk about strange creatures out in the forests of Arkansas, but I always thought it was just folklore or people misidentifying animals. After that night, I'm not so sure. Something real was out there, something that wanted us to know it was there. It never showed itself fully, never charged us, but the tension and fear it created was unlike anything I've experienced. We never reported it to anyone. What would we say? We heard a scream in the woods and got scared. We had no proof, no photos, nothing but the memory that still makes my heart race a bit whenever I think about it. That night changed my perception. I can't walk through a quiet stretch of forest now without feeling a hint of that old fear, wondering if something else is standing just beyond my line of sight, watching and waiting. We never went back to that spot, and honestly, I never want to. That night ended as abruptly as it started. One moment we were enjoying a moonlit stroll, and the next we were fleeing in terror. I still don't have a good explanation, and maybe I never will. It just happened, and then it was over. Whatever it was, it's still out there, somewhere among those trees. And I guess that's what scares me the most. Story 23. I remember it was late October 2005, maybe around 3 in the morning. I know it was close to Halloween because the pumpkins were still out on the neighbors' porches, and the air had that cold, dry edge that always reminded me we were heading into winter. I lived near Berryville, Arkansas, in a pretty quiet area, just a handful of houses spaced out by old orchards and small patches of woods. Normally, my nights were calm, but that night, the barking started and didn't stop. At first, I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just someone's dog that got spooked by a raccoon. But it wasn't just one dog. It was several. They were all going nuts, and it sounded like something was bothering them in a serious way. I got up, pulled on some jeans and a flannel, and headed to the back door. When I cracked it open, a blast of cold air hit me, and I realized the barking was even louder outside. It echoed off the trees, sharp and angry, like the dogs were seeing something they really didn't like. I grabbed a flashlight, just a standard one, nothing fancy, and stepped outside. The sky was clear, and I could see the outline of my small orchard a few yards away. I only had a couple of fruit trees, but they formed a little cluster that could hide just about anything in the dark. The dogs weren't mine, they belonged to my neighbors, but they were in full panic mode somewhere off to my right. I pointed the flashlight out toward the orchard and noticed something I couldn't explain, a large, dark shape moving behind the trees. My heart started pounding, and I tried to keep the beam steady. The shape was tall, taller than any normal person. I mean, I'm a fairly tall guy myself, but this thing looked like it could have been close to 7 or 8 feet, maybe more. It wasn't just tall, it was broad-shouldered, thick. Its outline reminded me of a big man wearing fur or a heavy coat, but it moved too smoothly for someone just bundled up in clothes. It sort of leaned forward, then straightened up again, like it was trying to get a better look at my place or at me. I wasn't sure. I couldn't make out its face. Actually, I couldn't see much detail at all, just a big, dark figure shifting its weight around and making these heavy, muffled footsteps on the ground. The leaves were dry, and I could hear them crackle as it moved. I stood there, holding my breath, not wanting to scare it off, but also terrified it might come closer. The dogs kept barking, but I was barely paying attention to them now. My focus was stuck on that silhouette. Something about the way it moved, that slight sway and the careful placement of its steps, made me think it was definitely aware of me. It wasn't just some random animal darting around. It seemed curious, cautious, I don't know. But it felt like it knew I was there and was deciding what to do next. For a few seconds, we both kind of froze. I shined the flashlight directly where I thought its head would be, and I swear I saw it turn away like it was trying to avoid the light. Then, before I could react, it started backing off, slow at first, then more quickly. I remember hearing branches snapping a bit higher up than you'd expect, like at the level of my chest or neck, which was odd because most animals that size would still be closer to the ground. This thing broke through those branches without much noise, aside from a few cracks and some rustling leaves. Then it just slipped away into the darkness beyond my orchard. The dogs kept barking for another minute or two, but whatever it was had moved on. I didn't hear heavy footsteps anymore. My heart was racing, and I just stood there for a bit, holding the flashlight and trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I eventually went back inside, locked the door, and sat down in my kitchen. I couldn't get the image of that huge silhouette out of my head. It definitely wasn't a bear. I've seen bears before, and they don't stand and move like that. It wasn't a person either. No human would be that tall and broad without me seeing a face, a jacket, some kind of recognizable clothing. But this was just a big, dark form. When morning came, I was still rattled. I waited until the sun was fully up before I grabbed my boots and went out to the orchard. I looked around, hoping to find some clear footprints. The ground was pretty hard, though, and covered in leaves, so there wasn't any obvious imprint. I did see something strange. A couple of branches on one of the fruit trees were snapped off higher than my head. They were not huge branches, but thick enough that I knew a regular person would struggle to break them so cleanly. It looked like something big and strong had just brushed right past them. There were no clear tracks to follow, and nothing else seemed disturbed. The other yards were quiet. I kept thinking about telling someone, but I knew how it'd sound. Some guy in Arkansas saw a giant creature in his orchard at 3 in the morning. People would think I was drunk or just making it up. I didn't feel comfortable sharing this with anyone outside my family. We all agreed it was best to keep quiet because, honestly, who'd believe it? It wasn't like it left some perfect footprint behind or let me take a picture. Even now I have no idea what it was. I've read stories online about sightings of large, hairy creatures, but it's not something you ever think you'll experience yourself. The feeling I got that night, the sense that I was looking at something not supposed to be there, still makes my skin crawl. I keep wondering if it was curious about me, or my orchard, or if it just wandered too close to the houses by accident. Nothing like that has happened since. Every fall I get a little nervous, especially when the nights turn cold and quiet. I can't explain what I saw, and part of me would rather not know. But I'll never forget that shape standing behind my fruit trees, breaking branches at a height no person could reach, and then fading back into the darkness without a sound. It's been almost 20 years, and I still replay that moment in my mind, trying to find a logical explanation. I never found one. It just happened, and then nothing. No trace, no reason, no second encounter. Just one terrifying night that I still don't understand. Story 24. I remember that morning in '98 so clearly, even though I've spent years trying to push it out of my head. It was just me and 3 buddies out near Sweetwater Lake in the Talladega National Forest, close to a little place called Delta, Alabama. It wasn't a well-known fishing spot, not crowded at all, especially on a weekday. That's exactly why we picked it. No boats passing by, no people yelling, no distractions. We just wanted a quiet morning, a few decent bass, and some time away from all the noise of our everyday lives. We got out there at dawn. The air was cool and smelled like wet leaves and that subtle, musty odor of lake water. We knew the routine. Push the small aluminum boat off the shore, crank the motor quietly, and drift to a peaceful spot. The surface of the lake was so still it looked like a sheet of black glass, the only ripples coming from our boat and the occasional fish jumping in the distance. There were birds singing in the trees behind us, maybe a few squirrels chattering, nothing out of the ordinary. The kind of morning that makes you feel lucky just to be alive, you know. We'd been there maybe an hour when it started. I was leaning over to adjust one of my rods, expecting maybe some movement in the water, when I heard something. It wasn't right next to us. It felt like it came from the other side of the lake, maybe off in the hills. It began as a deep, resonant howl, like a low moan at first, but it got louder and sharper, transforming into this shrieking scream. It sounded like something that shouldn't exist. I can't compare it to a wolf or a cougar or anything I've heard before. It was too long, too drawn out, and it shifted in pitch in a way that sent chills straight down my spine. I remember looking up and meeting my friend's eyes. None of us said a word, we just stared at each other. They looked as confused and unsettled as I felt. We were grown men, used to the woods, used to hunting, fishing, and camping all around Alabama. We'd all heard fox screams, bobcats, even the occasional strange echo in the forest. But this was different. This sound had a power behind it that I can't describe. It felt like it echoed off every tree and rock, like it was bouncing back at us from all sides, making it impossible to pinpoint where exactly it came from. It just kept going, and I swear it got even louder for a moment. It's like it was announcing its presence, letting us know we were not alone out there. I remember feeling the hair on the back of my neck standing up, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. We weren't armed for anything big, just some light gear, a cooler with drinks and sandwiches, and a few cheap fishing knives. Nothing that would help if something decided to come at us from the shore. Without a single word, we started packing up our gear. I tried to do it quietly, but my hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped a tackle box into the water. One of my friends pulled the anchor in carefully, and another reached for the ignition. The scream continued, but as we scrambled to get out of there, it started changing. It began to taper off into a kind of whooping sound, quieter but still echoing over the lake. Eventually, it just died down, leaving us with the pounding silence and our own breathing. We got the engine going and moved as fast as that little boat could handle without causing too big a wake. I kept looking over my shoulder at the tree line. The morning light was still weak, and the forest looked darker than it should. I couldn't see anything obvious, no large shape moving between the trunks, no silhouette on the ridge. But I had this overwhelming feeling that we were being watched, that something was standing behind those trees, following us with its eyes. We couldn't get away fast enough. Every second felt longer than it should have. I was expecting that scream to start again at any moment, maybe even closer this time. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't draw a full breath. As we rounded a bend in the lake, the sound just stopped altogether, like it had never been there. The birds went quiet too, at least for a few moments. It was like nature itself was holding its breath. We finally made it back to where we had launched. We dragged the boat out and tossed our gear into the back of the truck, all of us moving in this nervous, rushed silence. Only when we got back onto the dirt road did anyone mutter something like, "What the hell was that?" But even then, we didn't really discuss it in detail. It felt too strange, too raw. We knew we'd heard something that we couldn't explain, something that sounded bigger and more powerful than any animal we knew lived in those parts. To this day, I don't know what to call it. Some people like to say it might have been a Bigfoot or something similar. Others say it's just some sort of unknown animal cry that happens in the deep woods. All I know is that I've been hunting and fishing in Alabama for most of my life, and I've never heard anything remotely like that before or since. It wasn't just a weird noise. There was this feeling behind it, like an intelligence or an anger, something beyond just an animal calling out. I've tried telling this story a few times over the years, and usually I can see the skepticism in people's eyes. They think we heard a fox or a wounded deer. But I was there, and I can't shake how my heart nearly stopped, and how my stomach dropped when that scream hit my ears. The fear I felt was different. It wasn't just surprise. It was like my body knew something wasn't right. Something was telling me to get the hell out of there. Looking back, I'm grateful that we never actually saw whatever it was. Hearing that scream was enough. Seeing it might have been too much, and who knows what could have happened if we had stuck around or tried to get a better look. We just left, and the woods went silent again. No explanation, no final clue, nothing. Just the memory of that horrible sound echoing in my head every time I think back to that morning on Sweetwater Lake. I guess I'll never really know what made that noise. It happened and ended just as fast, leaving us rattled and confused. I haven't been back to that exact spot since. I still fish, but I stick to more popular areas now. Maybe it's irrational, but I can't shake the feeling that something's still out there, watching and waiting in those quiet corners of the forest. And every time I think of that scream, I get the same chill running through me, reminding me that we don't always know what's out there, even in places we think we're familiar with. Sometimes we just have to accept we've heard something beyond our understanding and leave it at that. Story 25. I remember this happened in January 2013, right on Highway 51 near Hsbor, Alabama. It was late afternoon, maybe around 5 or 5:30 p.m., because the sun was getting low, but it wasn't dark yet. The sky was completely clear, and the temperature was mild for that time of year. I was just driving home after visiting a friend a few towns over. I'd taken that route 100 times before, without anything strange ever happening, so I was in that casual, almost autopilot mode of driving, looking ahead, but not expecting anything out of the ordinary. As I came around a slight bend in the road, I noticed something standing on the shoulder up ahead. At first, I just assumed it was a person, maybe a hitchhiker, or someone who had a breakdown. There were no other cars around, which was normal on that stretch at that hour, so it felt a bit odd. I slowed down a bit, not because I thought I'd help, but more to understand what I was looking at. It seemed tall. I mean, really tall. I remember my gut telling me something was off even before I fully registered what I was seeing. As I got closer, it turned slightly to face me. That's when I saw that it was covered in dark, shaggy hair, definitely not clothing, but thick, uneven hair or fur. It had broad shoulders, and the way it stood wasn't like a hunched animal. It was upright, balanced, like a human. But it didn't look human. Its proportions were all off. The legs and arms were long, and the torso was huge. I swear it must have stood at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. I actually leaned forward, tightening my grip on the steering wheel, trying to make sense of it through my windshield. Then my headlights caught its eyes. They reflected this strange yellowish-green light, almost like how animals' eyes flash at night when caught by a beam. But this wasn't night, and the sun was still out. It was more like they had their own faint glow. I know that sounds unbelievable, but that's what I remember. I felt my stomach twist into a knot. I'm not a person who scares easily, but there was this sudden feeling that I was looking at something I shouldn't be seeing. As I rolled closer, my heart was pounding. I wasn't sure if I should stop or just keep going. The creature, because I don't know what else to call it, raised one arm, kind of shielding its face from my headlights. The movement looked oddly human, like it was irritated or just didn't like the bright light. But everything else about it was anything but human. I slowed down to maybe 15 mph, just crawling along, trying to process what I was seeing. That's when it took a few steps onto the road, right in front of me. The steps were long, powerful, and it didn't seem uncertain at all. It crossed the entire highway in 2 or 3 strides, disappearing into the trees and brush on the other side. It was so fast and yet so calm. No panic, no rush. It just moved out of my sight as if it knew exactly where to go. I stopped my car in the middle of the highway. My hands were shaking. The road was empty as far as I could see, and the only sound was my engine idling. I must have sat there for a good 30 seconds, staring at the spot where it had vanished. My mind was racing. Could it have been a bear? But bears don't walk like that, at least not smoothly across a highway on 2 legs. And I've seen black bears before, even upright. They're clumsy when they stand, and this thing moved gracefully. Could it have been someone in a suit playing a prank? But who would do that, out here in January, with no witnesses, no camera crew, nothing? I thought about getting out of the car, but every cell in my body screamed that it was a bad idea. I couldn't shake this feeling of unease and dread. My heart was still hammering and my mouth was dry. I just sat there, breathing heavily, feeling like I had trespassed on something I shouldn't have seen. Eventually, I decided to move on. There was no point in waiting to see if it came back. The sun was dropping lower, and I didn't want to be stranded there after dark. As I drove off, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting it to step back out onto the road behind me. But nothing happened. Everything looked normal again, just a quiet stretch of highway in rural Alabama. I passed a couple of old farmhouses and then some fields, but my mind was still stuck back at that spot. I think I pulled over once more, a few miles down the road, to catch my breath and to try to convince myself that I hadn't imagined it. But I knew what I'd seen. I wasn't sleepy or drunk or anything like that. I was completely sober, and the day had been normal until that moment. After I got home, I didn't talk about it for a long time. I mean, who would believe me? People would laugh or say I must have seen a bear, or maybe some really tall guy in a ghillie suit messing around. But I know what I saw. I know how it made me feel, like I'd just witnessed something that lives on the edges of what we understand. It wasn't just the sight of it. It was the way it seemed aware of me. It knew I was there, and it reacted, even if just slightly, to my car's headlights. That brief eye contact, or whatever you'd call it, still gives me chills. It's been years now, and I still think about it. I've driven down that same stretch of Highway 51 since then, during the day, at night, in different seasons. I never saw anything like it again. That one evening in January 2013 stands alone in my memory. I can't explain it. I don't claim to know what it was. I just know that it wasn't a bear, it wasn't a normal person, and it wasn't any creature I've ever known to exist. It looked so real, and yet so impossible. I guess I'm sharing this now because I've seen other people mention strange sightings in wooded areas, and it's made me feel a bit less alone. I've never found a neat explanation or a satisfying conclusion. It happened, and then it just ended. The thing disappeared into the trees, and I drove away, left with nothing but questions and a memory that still unsettles me to this day.